After my husband's funeral, my own daughter drove me to a deserted dirt road and told me this was where I got off. She said the house and the business were hers now. I stood in the dust, clutching my bag as she drove away without looking back. No phone, no money. She thought she was leaving me to die. But my daughter forgot one crucial detail. Before her father died, we balanced our ledgers. She had no idea what I had already done. The leather passenger seat of Chloe's Range Rover felt freezing against my back. The heavy scent of white lilies and damp earth still clung to my black morning coat. We had just watched Thomas, my husband of 40 years, being lowered into the ground at Oakwood Cemetery. The sky was the color of bruised iron, threatening a massive storm that the local news had been warning about all week. Chloe kept both hands firmly on the steering wheel. Her posture was rigid. Just 20 minutes earlier, she had been putting on a spectacular performance by the graveside. She had wept into a designer tissue, leaning heavily on the arm of her husband Greg. She had played the part of the devastated daughter so perfectly that several of our church friends had come over to comfort her instead of me. I had stood silently under the green canvas canopy, watching her crocodile tears, feeling a strange disconnect from the woman sitting beside me now. I wiped a smudge of rain from the side window and looked at the passing scenery. We were supposed to be heading to the country club for the reception. 200 guests were waiting for us. Business partners from our freight logistics company, extended family members, neighbors who had known Thomas since we bought our first delivery truck back in the 80s. But Chloe did not take the exit for the country club. She drove straight past the highway ramp, keeping her foot steady on the gas pedal. I turned my head to look at her. At 35, Chloe looked exactly like her father. She had his sharp jawline and his pale blue eyes, but she had none of his character. "You missed the exit," I said. My voice was calm. 40 years of working as a corporate auditor had taught me how to keep my tone neutral when I spotted a discrepancy. You do not react emotionally when the numbers do not add up. You simply observe and gather data. "I need a minute away from the crowd," Chloe replied. Her voice was flat. The weeping, trembling daughter from the cemetery had vanished completely. She took a sharp right turn onto County Road 9. I knew this area. Thomas and I used to drive out this way decades ago when we were scouting locations for a new warehouse. County Road 9 led away from the suburbs and straight into a dense, heavily wooded area near the state park line. It was miles away from any residential neighborhood. I glanced at the dashboard clock. It was 2:15 in the afternoon. Then I looked at the digital map glowing on the console. Chloe had disabled the navigation system. "Turn the car around, Chloe. People are waiting for us," I said. Suddenly, the automatic locks engaged with a loud, sharp click. The sound echoed in the quiet cabin of the SUV. "Hand over your purse, Mom," Chloe said. She did not look at me. Her eyes remained fixed on the wet asphalt ahead of us. I placed my hands firmly over my black leather handbag, resting it on my lap. "Excuse me," I said. "Hand it over," she repeated. Her tone was completely devoid of warmth. "I need to keep it safe. You are very emotional right now. You are not thinking clearly." I looked at my daughter. Really looked at her. I noted the expensive silk blouse she had worn under her coat. I noted the diamond tennis bracelet on her wrist. I also knew that her husband, Greg, was drowning. As an auditor, I always paid attention to the invisible ledgers people carried around with them. Greg was a slick investment broker who talked loudly about his successes, but I had seen the subtle signs of financial ruin for months. The leased cars they kept trading in. The passive-aggressive comments Greg made about Thomas, refusing to give him a board position at our logistics company. The way Chloe would carefully avoid talking about their mortgage payments. "I am perfectly clear-headed," I told her. "Turn this vehicle around right now." Chloe hit the brakes hard, causing the heavy SUV to skid slightly on the wet pavement before coming to a stop on the narrow shoulder of the road. We were surrounded by thick pine trees. The rain started to fall harder, drumming against the roof of the car. She unbuckled her seatbelt and turned her entire body toward me. The mask was completely gone now. There was no grief in her eyes. There was only cold, calculated greed. "Dad is gone," she said, leaning closer to me. "The gravy train stops today. Greg is already at the estate." My heart gave a heavy, painful thud against my ribs. "What are you talking about?" "Greg did not ride with us from the cemetery," she explained with a cruel little smile. "He left early. He is at your house right now. He is changing the security codes on the gates. He is having a locksmith swap out the deadbolts on the front and back doors. By the time this storm passes, your keys will be entirely useless." I stared at her, forcing my breathing to stay slow and measured. In through the nose, out through the mouth. Panic is the enemy of logic. I processed the information she was giving me. Greg was at my home. The $2 million estate Thomas and I had built from the ground up. You cannot legally lock me out of my own home, I stated factually. The deed is in my name. Actually, it is not just your name anymore, Chloe said smoothly. She reached into her center console and pulled out a folded piece of paper. She tossed it onto my lap. I picked it up. It was a photocopy of a power of attorney document. I scanned the text quickly. My eyes jumped to the signature line at the bottom. It was my signature, or at least a very good forgery of it. It granted Greg full administrative control over my personal assets and medical decisions. We had this drawn up weeks ago, Chloe said, watching my face for a reaction. We knew Dad was not going to make it through the month. We also knew you were becoming far too fragile to handle a complex business and a massive estate all by yourself. I am 68 years old, I said, keeping my voice dangerously low. I balance the corporate tax ledgers for a company with a fleet of 40 freight trucks. I am not fragile. Chloe let out a harsh, dismissive laugh. Oh, Mom, you are so confused. Everyone at the funeral reception is talking about it right now. What have you done, Chloe? I have been laying the groundwork, she said proudly. For the past 3 months, I have been telling all your friends from church, all the neighbors, and all the corporate board members about your tragic mental decline. I told them how you forget where you put your keys. I told them how you get agitated and aggressive. I told them Dad was hiding your dementia from the world to protect your dignity. I spent the entire morning at the funeral whispering to people about how worried I am that you might wander off. A cold chill washed over my arms and legs. I looked out the passenger window. The pavement had ended a mile back. We were parked on a dirt road that was quickly turning into mud under the heavy rain. I reached into my coat pocket and pulled out my smartphone. I looked at the top corner of the screen. No service, not a single bar. She had chosen this exact route because she knew it was a dead zone. The closest cell tower was miles away on the other side of the ridge. As a corporate auditor, I mapped out logistics and tracking systems for our trucking fleet. I knew the geography of this county better than anyone. Chloe knew I would not be able to call for help here. Give me the purse, Mom, Chloe demanded again. She reached across the console, trying to grab the leather strap. I yanked it back, pressing it firmly against my chest. Do not touch me. You need to listen to me very carefully, Chloe said. Her voice dropped to a vicious whisper. Greg owes money, a lot of money. The brokerage firm is going under, and he made some very bad guarantees to some very dangerous people. We need the freight company. We already have the buyers lined up. We are selling the entire fleet and the warehouses by the end of the week. You cannot sell the company on the strength of a forged power of attorney, I told her. The board will challenge any transfer, and the state registry will scrutinize the authority behind it. You are out of your depth, Chloe. You and Greg are going to go to federal prison. We have the power of attorney, Chloe snapped back. And once we get the original charter documents out of your floor safe, we will bypass the board entirely. Greg knows how to force the sale. We just need you out of the way for 48 hours while the transaction's clear. She glared at my purse. I need the keys to your floor safe. And I need your phone so you cannot cause a scene until the ink is dry. Hand it over. I looked at the daughter I had raised. I thought about all the piano lessons, the college tuition, the down payment Thomas and I had gifted them for their first home. All of it meant absolutely nothing to her. She was willing to destroy my entire life to cover her husband's gambling and financial fraud. No, I said. Chloe reached across the center console and unlatched my door. The cold air rushed inside, biting through the thin fabric of my black morning dress. Get out, she commanded. Her voice did not shake. It was perfectly level, stripped of any warmth or hesitation. She was looking straight ahead through the windshield, her hands gripping the leather steering wheel. I looked at my daughter, the girl I had rocked to sleep during thunderstorms, the teenager I had helped apply to colleges, the woman who was now staring at the rainy road with dead, empty eyes. You cannot possibly think this will work, I told her. The corporate lawyers will require my physical presence to transfer the logistics company. The bank will flag the accounts. Chloe leaned closer to me. The scent of her expensive floral perfume mixed with the cold smell of the rain. We have the medical documents, Mom. Greg paid a very generous doctor to sign a sworn affidavit stating you are suffering from rapid onset dementia. The courts will give us emergency conservatorship by tomorrow morning. Now get out of my car. I did not move. I held my purse tightly against my chest. Chloe let out a sharp sigh. She reached over and shoved my shoulder hard. I lost my balance. I tumbled backward out of the high passenger seat and landed heavily in the mud. The impact sent a sharp jolt of pain up my spine. My purse slipped from my grasp and landed in a puddle. Before I could reach for it, Chloe grabbed the strap. She pulled my purse back inside the vehicle. "This is where you get off," she said, looking down at me as I knelt in the freezing mud. "The house and the business are mine now." She slammed the heavy door shut. The locks engaged with a loud click. She shifted the vehicle into drive and hit the gas. The tires spun, spraying a thick layer of wet dirt all over my coat and my face. I sat in the mud and watched the bright red taillights of her car speed away down the dark village road. Within seconds, the car disappeared around a sharp bend. I was completely alone. The storm was getting worse. The wind howled through the pine branches, dropping the temperature rapidly. I stood up slowly. My knees ached. My black dress was soaked through to the skin. My shoes were caked in heavy mud. I was stranded miles away from the city limits with no purse, no identification, and no shelter. A normal 68-year-old widow might have broken down. A normal mother might have fallen to her knees and wept at the sheer cruelty of her own child. But I did not cry. Crying is a biological reaction to a loss of control. I spent my entire career as a corporate auditor. My job was to step into chaotic, failing businesses and find the missing numbers. I specialized in hostile takeovers and fraud recovery. When a company is bleeding out, you do not panic. You assess your remaining assets. You identify your liabilities. You formulate a strategy. My liabilities were clear. I was freezing. I was stranded. My daughter had stolen my primary identification and my bank cards. My home was compromised, but she had underestimated my assets. I reached into the thick wool of my morning coat. 3 years ago, when our freight logistics company started handling higher-risk shipments, I asked my tailor to sew a concealed, waterproof pocket into the inner lining of my daily coats. It was a paranoid habit born from years of dealing with untrustworthy corporate executives. You never give anyone complete control over your mobility. My cold, stiff fingers found the hidden zipper near my ribcage. I pulled it open. I reached inside and pulled out a small plastic bag. Inside the bag was a crisp $100 bill and a cheap prepaid flip phone. The phone felt light and fragile in my palm, but it was fully charged. I opened it and waited for the screen to light up. The signal indicator flashed in the corner. I had 2 bars of service. It was just enough. I dialed a number I knew by heart. It belonged to the only person in the world I could trust right now. Lucas. He was 21 years old, a brilliant cybersecurity student at the State University. He was the son of my eldest boy, who had passed away many years ago. Lucas had always possessed a quiet, intense loyalty to our family. He had spent the morning standing quietly beside me at his grandfather's grave. The phone rang 3 times before he answered. "Hello?" His voice sounded exhausted. "Lucas, it is Grandma," I said. I raised my voice to be heard over the howling wind. "Grandma, where are you?" "The reception at the country club is starting. Aunt Chloe just walked in crying. She said you got confused and wandered off from the cemetery. People are looking for you." The sheer audacity of her lie sent a spike of cold fury straight through my chest. She was already spinning her narrative to the 200 guests at the reception. "I did not wander off," I told him firmly. Chloe drove me out to the old logging routes near the state park. She pushed me out of her car and stole my purse. "She is trying to seize the house and the company. I need you to come get me right now." There was a beat of stunned silence on the other end of the line. Then, the sound of keys jingling. "I am on my way," Lucas said. His voice was completely different now. The sleepy college student was gone, replaced by sharp, focused energy. "Drop a pin on your GPS if you can. If not, look for a mile marker." "I am near the old water tower ruins on County Road 9, I said. "Hurry, Lucas. The temperature is dropping fast." I closed the phone and slipped it back into my hidden pocket. I crossed my arms tightly over my chest to preserve my body heat. The rain was relentless, soaking my hair and running down the back of my neck in icy streams. Every minute felt like an hour. I stood under the meager shelter of a large pine tree, listening to the storm and organizing the facts in my mind. Chloe and Greg had planned this perfectly. They knew Thomas was dying. They had used the distraction of his illness to forge medical documents. They wanted to sell the freight company to cover Greg's massive financial debts. But they needed me out of the picture to finalize the corporate transfer. 20 minutes later, 2 dim headlights pierced the darkness. A battered blue sedan came speeding down the dirt road, hitting the potholes and sending muddy water flying into the air. The car skidded to a halt a few yards away from me. The passenger door popped open. Lucas leaned over from the driver's seat. His face was pale and tight with worry. "Get in, Grandma. Quick!" I climbed into the car and pulled the door shut. The heater was blasting on full power. The sudden warmth hit my freezing skin, making my fingers tingle painfully. I buckled my seatbelt as Lucas immediately threw the car into reverse, turned us around, and hit the gas. "Are you hurt? Did she hit you?" Lucas asked. His hands were gripping the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles were white. "I am bruised, but nothing is broken," I said. I rubbed my freezing hands together. "Thank you for coming, Lucas." He did not say "you are welcome." He just stared at the dark, rainy road ahead. "Aunt Chloe is putting on a massive show back at the country club," he said. "She is telling everyone that your mind has been gone for months. She claimed Grandpa was covering for you to protect your pride. She actually had people crying for her. It is a strategic narrative," I explained. I grabbed a napkin from his cup holder to wipe the mud off my cheek. "She needs the community to view me as legally incompetent. If I am declared unfit, she and Greg can exercise their forged power of attorney. They intend to liquidate the entire logistics company." Lucas reached over and grabbed his laptop from the back seat. He placed it carefully on the center console between us. The screen was glowing in the dark cabin. Lines of code and text were scrolling rapidly across a black terminal window. "I am running a program that intercepts and transcribes the local emergency dispatch radio," Lucas explained, keeping his eyes on the road. "When you called me, I knew something terrible was happening. I wanted to see if Aunt Chloe was crazy enough to involve the police." Before I could ask what he meant, a digitized voice spoke through the laptop speakers. The audio was slightly grainy, carrying the flat, urgent tone of a police dispatcher. "Attention all units. We have an active silver alert. Suspect is a 68-year-old Caucasian female gray hair wearing a black morning coat. Name is Helen. Family reports severe dementia and extreme paranoia. Subject is considered a danger to herself. Do not approach aggressively. Family has provided an emergency psychiatric custody order signed by a judge. If located, detain and transport immediately to Oak Hill Psychiatric Facility for mandatory evaluation. I repeat, active silver alert." The robotic voice clicked off, leaving the car in total silence, except for the rhythmic thumping of the windshield wipers. I stared at the laptop screen. A cold, heavy dread settled in my stomach. The situation was far worse than a simple theft. A silver alert. That was the emergency protocol used for missing elderly people with severe cognitive decline. Chloe had not just reported me missing. She had utilized a pre-signed psychiatric custody order. She had likely paid off a corrupt judge or a dirty doctor to push the paperwork through without an evaluation, Grandma Lucas said softly. He slowed the car as we approached the paved highway that led back into the city. "If a patrol car spots my license plate, they will pull us over. If they find you, they will not listen to a word you say. They will strap you to a gurney and lock you inside a psychiatric ward. Once you are in there, Aunt Chloe has total control over your life." He was right. In the eyes of the law, I was no longer a respected corporate auditor or a grieving widow. I was a confused, dangerous liability. If I tried to walk into a police station to report my daughter for theft, they would simply view it as a paranoid delusion. They would hand me right back to the monster who abandoned me in the woods. "We cannot go to my house," I said, thinking rapidly. "Greg is there with a locksmith. We cannot go to the police. The alert is already active across the entire county." "Where do we go?" Lucas asked. He stopped at a red light at the edge of the highway. A police cruiser drove past us in the opposite direction. Both of us held our breath until its taillights disappeared into the rain. "Turn left," I instructed him. "There is an old cheap motel on Interstate 4, the kind that takes cash and does not ask for identification." Lucas hit the turn signal. We merged onto the highway, driving away from the wealthy suburbs and toward the gritty industrial outskirts of the city. "They are going to check your bank accounts," Lucas warned me. "The moment you try to use a credit card or withdraw cash, Greg will get a ping. He has your financial portfolio under his thumb right now." I reached into my wet coat pocket. I pulled out the crisp $100 bill and placed it on the dashboard. "They do not have everything," I said quietly. We drove in silence for a few miles. The reality of my new existence was beginning to solidify. I was a fugitive. My husband was dead. My daughter had orchestrated a hostile takeover of my entire existence. She had stripped me of my home, my business, and my basic human rights. She thought she had left me completely powerless. But Chloe had made a fatal miscalculation. She assumed that because I was a senior citizen, I was obsolete. She assumed that my silence during Thomas's illness was a sign of weakness. I looked at Lucas. He was gripping the steering wheel, his young face hardened with resolve. He was ready to fight. And so was I. "Lucas," I said, watching the neon signs of the cheap motel approaching in the distance. "When we get to the room, I need you to bypass the firewall on Greg's brokerage accounts. I want to see exactly how much money he owes and who he owes it to. We are going to find his creditors." Lucas nodded once. "Consider it done. My daughter wanted to play a game of corporate theft and legal manipulation. She wanted to treat my life like a balance sheet. I was going to show her exactly what happens when you trigger an audit from a woman who has nothing left to lose." We pulled into the dark parking lot of the motel. The rain continued to wash over the windshield. I had no home to return to. I had no police to call for help. I was officially a ghost. But ghosts have a way of haunting the people who create them. And I was going to haunt my daughter until she lost absolutely everything. Room number 12 of the roadside motel smelled of stale cigarette smoke and cheap lemon bleach. The flickering neon sign outside cast a sickly orange glow through the thin curtains, illuminating the water stains on the ceiling. It was a place designed for people who wanted to disappear. For tonight, that included me. I sat on the edge of a sagging mattress, shivering in my damp morning dress. Lucas had thrown his oversized college sweatshirt over my shoulders the moment I climbed into his car. He was sitting at the small laminate desk across the room. The glowing screen of his laptop illuminated his face. His fingers were moving rapidly across the keyboard. I pulled my burner phone from my pocket and set it on the nightstand. Then I pulled Lucas's secondary tablet onto my lap. I needed to assess the damage immediately. I navigated to the private banking portal where Thomas and I had kept our primary operational funds. I typed in my credentials, relying on muscle memory. A stark red banner flashed across the screen. "Account access restricted. Please contact your wealth management administrator." A cold, familiar sensation settled in my stomach. It was the same feeling I used to get during corporate audits when I uncovered a deliberately hidden offshore account. I picked up the burner phone and dialed my private banker. We had worked together for 15 years. I knew he would be at his desk working late to close out the quarterly reports. He answered on the first ring. "Richard, it is Helen," I said. My voice was perfectly steady. "I need you to lift the restriction on my primary checking account immediately." There was a long, painful silence on the other end of the line. When Richard finally spoke, his voice was tight with genuine distress. "Helen, I am so sorry. I cannot do that," he said. "I was told you were resting at a specialized care facility. Your son-in-law, Greg, came into the branch office 3 hours ago. He brought your daughter with him. They presented a court-certified power of attorney." I closed my eyes. The sound of the rain lashing against the motel window seemed to grow louder. "On what grounds did the bank accept it without my physical presence?" I asked. "They had an emergency medical injunction," Richard explained gently. "They presented a sworn affidavit from a board-certified neurologist. The document stated you are suffering from advanced rapid-onset cognitive decline. It declared you legally incompetent to manage your own financial affairs." I had no choice, Helen. The legal department reviewed it. The documents were ironclad. Greg is now the primary signatory on all your liquid assets. He froze your access to protect you from financial exploitation. Protect me. The irony was so thick it was almost suffocating. "Thank you, Richard," I said quietly. I closed the flip phone and set it down. I did not throw the phone against the wall. I did not scream. Anger is a useless emotion when you are actively bleeding out. As a certified public accountant, I treated this crisis the same way I treated a failing corporation. I needed to isolate the hemorrhage and identify the hostile actors. Greg had frozen my accounts. He had cut off my liquidity. He had branded me a psychiatric invalid. He wanted me to feel entirely powerless. But Greg was a reckless investment broker who lived on borrowed money and fake confidence. He played with other people's wealth because he had none of his own. Lucas, I said, looking across the dim motel room. "Stop trying to access my accounts. They are gone. We need to shift our focus to Greg." Lucas stopped typing. He looked at me, his dark eyes wide behind his wire-rimmed glasses. "He locked you out of everything." "Yes," I replied. He used a fabricated medical evaluation to trigger an emergency conservatorship. I have zero access to my money. But people like Greg do not orchestrate a multi-million-dollar hostile takeover of their own family just because they are greedy. They do it because they are desperate. I need you to find his desperation. Lucas turned back to his laptop. His posture stiffened with renewed focus. Thomas had bought Lucas his first computer when he was just 10 years old. While other grandfathers took their grandsons fishing, Thomas had taught Lucas how to build servers. I had taught him how to read financial markets. We had raised a young man who understood that data was the most valuable currency in the world. "Give me a minute," Lucas murmured. "I am routing my connection through a secure virtual private network. I am going to ping the public registry for his real estate licenses and cross-reference it with his current brokerage firm." I watched him work. The silence in the room was absolute save for the rapid clicking of the keyboard. For 20 minutes, I sat wrapped in that damp sweatshirt, mentally running through the inventory of my logistics company. We owned 40 commercial freight trucks. We owned 3 massive distribution warehouses. We had lucrative contracts with major supply chain distributors. The business was worth over $15 million. It was a cash-rich enterprise. "I got something," Lucas said suddenly. His voice broke the silence like a gunshot. "What are you seeing?" I asked, walking over to stand behind his chair. "I breached a secured server hosting his brokerage firm's internal communications," Lucas explained, pointing to a cascade of emails on his screen. "Greg's firm is completely insolvent. They have been failing for over a year. He has been moving money around to cover massive margin calls. But that is not the worst part. Show me the ledger," I commanded. Lucas pulled up a digitized bank statement. It did not belong to a traditional financial institution. The header bore the logo of a private equity firm called Apex Capital Syndicate. "I recognize that name," I said, leaning closer to the screen. My chest tightened. "They are not a legitimate equity firm. They are predatory lenders. They target failing businesses, offer exorbitant bridge loans with toxic interest rates, and then seize the remaining assets when the borrower inevitably defaults. They are loan sharks in tailored Italian suits. Look at the principal amount." Lucas pointed to the bottom of the document. My eyes scanned the numbers. Greg had taken out a personal loan against his own home, his cars, and his brokerage license. The total debt was $1.5 million. "He is drowning," I whispered. I felt a strange, cold satisfaction. I was looking at the exact motive for my husband's murder and my own exile. "It gets worse, Grandma. Look at the terms of the loan." Lucas highlighted a paragraph of dense legal text. I read the clause. The loan was structured as a short-term balloon note. The entire principal plus $300,000 in interest was due in full. "When is the maturity date?" I asked. Lucas checked the timestamp on the digital contract. 48 hours from now. If he does not pay Apex Capital by Friday morning, they will liquidate everything he owns. They will destroy his brokerage firm and seize his house. "He does not have that kind of money," I said. "He lives entirely on credit. That is why he needed me out of the way today. He needs to sell my company to pay off the syndicate." Lucas opened another intercepted email thread. He scrolled down to a message sent just 2 hours ago, right around the time Chloe was forcing me out of her car on the dirt road. "You are right," Lucas said, his voice dropping to an anxious whisper. "He is already brokering the sale. He reached out to Vanguard Logistics, your biggest corporate rival. He offered them a hostile buyout of your entire freight fleet and all 3 warehouses. For how much?" I demanded. $15 million, Lucas replied. I felt a surge of pure, unfiltered rage. $15 million. That was close to the company's true market value, which made the theft more calculated, not less. Greg was not merely dumping 40 years of my life's work. He intended to steal its full value, pay off his predatory lenders, and walk away with millions that had never belonged to him. Vanguard accepted the offer. Lucas continued reading the email thread. "They are fast-tracking the acquisition. They agreed to wire the funds into an escrow account within 48 hours. Greg told them he has full legal authority to sign over the corporate shares because you are medically incapacitated. He is going to use the forged power of attorney to authorize the transfer," I said. I paced across the small motel room. My mind was moving 100 miles an hour. "Can he actually do that?" Lucas asked. "Can he sell an entire corporation just with a piece of paper?" "Normally, yes," I explained. "A standard power of attorney grants the proxy complete authority to liquidate assets, sell real estate, and transfer corporate ownership. Vanguard Logistics will look at the court order. They will see my forged signature, and their lawyers will gladly push the sale through. They want our trucking routes too badly to ask difficult questions. Then we have lost, Lucas said. He slumped back in his chair. If Vanguard wires that money, Greg pays off the syndicate. The company is gone. We cannot stop a corporate acquisition in 2 days without access to your bank accounts or a lawyer. I stopped pacing. I turned to face my grandson. I felt a slow, dangerous smile pull at the corners of my mouth. I am a corporate auditor, Lucas. I spent my life finding loopholes in airtight contracts. Do you honestly think I would leave a $15 million company vulnerable to a simple piece of paper? Lucas looked up, a spark of hope returning to his eyes. What did you do 5 years ago when your grandfather first got sick? We realized how dangerous the corporate landscape was becoming, I explained. We knew that if anything happened to our physical health, ambitious rivals would circle us like vultures. So we amended the foundational corporate charter for our logistics company. We embedded a poison pill into the operating agreement. What kind of poison pill? I walked back to the desk and rested my hands on the back of his chair. We added a biometric security clause to Article 7 of the corporate charter. It states that the company cannot be sold, merged, or liquidated in its entirety under any proxy agreement. A power of attorney is legally insufficient to authorize a total asset transfer. So how does the company get sold? Lucas asked. It requires the original, notarized corporate charter document, I said, and it requires my physical biometric thumbprint stamped directly onto the signature page in the presence of the corporate board. If Vanguard Logistics tries to buy my company using Greg's fraudulent power of attorney, the state business registry will automatically reject the transfer. The sale cannot go through without that specific document. Lucas's eyes widened in realization. Greg does not know about the biometric clause. I thinks the power of attorney is enough. Exactly, I said. When Vanguard's legal team reviews the actual corporate charter, they will demand the biometric signature. Greg's entire plan will hit a brick wall. The sale will collapse. He will default on his debt to the syndicate, and they will tear his life apart. We just need to show Vanguard the corporate charter, Lucas said excitedly. He reached for his keyboard. I can pull up the digital copy from the state registry right now. Do not bother, I told him. My voice grew hard. Lucas stopped. Why not? Because Greg is a parasite, but he is not entirely stupid. If he is running a hostile takeover, he will have already hired a hacker to corrupt or delete the digital files on the state server. He needs Vanguard to believe the power of attorney is sufficient. The only way to prove the existence of the biometric clause and stop this sale is to produce the original physical document with the embossed state seal. Where is the original document? Lucas asked. The tone of his voice suggested he already knew the answer, and he was terrified of it. I looked at the rain lashing against the cheap motel window. I thought about my beautiful estate. I thought about the heavy reinforced steel floor safe hidden beneath the Persian rug in my home office. It is locked inside my floor safe, I said quietly. You mean the safe inside your house, Lucas clarified. The same house that Greg and Aunt Chloe are currently occupying. The same house where they just changed all the security codes and the deadbolts. Yes, I replied. Lucas stared at me. The reality of our situation settled heavily over the small motel room. The only object that could stop Greg from destroying my legacy was sitting directly underneath his feet. He and Chloe were likely drinking my expensive wine right now, celebrating their victory, completely unaware that a ticking time bomb was locked in the floor beneath them. We have to go back, I said. I pulled the damp sweatshirt tighter around my shoulders. We have to break into my own home tonight. The storm provided the perfect acoustic cover. The relentless drumming of the rain against the pavement masked the sound of Lucas bringing his battered sedan to a halt 1 block away from the wrought iron gates of my estate. We sat in the dark cabin for a moment. The windshield wipers swept back and forth in a hypnotic rhythm. I looked through the rain at the property Thomas and I had purchased 30 years ago. Back then it was just a modest brick house on a large plot of land. Over the decades, as our freight company expanded, we had renovated and expanded the home into a sprawling $2 million estate. It was supposed to be my sanctuary. Tonight it looked like a fortress occupied by enemy forces. Greg had wasted no time. Even from a distance, I could see the glowing blue rings of brand-new digital keypads installed on the main gate and the front portico. He moved fast, Lucas whispered. He stared at the blue lights through the rain-blurred glass. Those are biometric deadbolts with cellular uplinks. If we try to tamper with the keypads, Greg will get a notification on his phone instantly. I pulled the hood of my damp morning coat over my head. Greg is an investment broker, I replied softly. He understands how to buy expensive security, but he does not understand how a house actually breathes. He replaced the digital interfaces, but the analog nervous system of this property was wired in 1992. I know exactly where the blind spots are. Grab your tablet. We stepped out into the freezing downpour. The cold mud instantly soaked through my ruined shoes, but I ignored the discomfort. I led Lucas away from the main driveway, guiding him through a dense thicket of tall rhododendron bushes that lined the eastern edge of the property boundary. The thorny branches tore at my black dress, but they provided excellent cover from the street. When we reached the towering brick wall that surrounded the backyard, I knelt in the wet dirt and pushed aside a heavy patch of ivy. Concealed behind the thick green leaves was a rusted metal utility box. Thomas insisted on keeping the original analog junction box when we upgraded the power grid 10 years ago, I explained. My fingers were stiff from the cold, but I managed to pry the metal latch open. The security vendor told him it was obsolete. Thomas told the vendor that old wires never lie. Lucas knelt beside me in the mud. He pulled a thick cable from his backpack and connected it to his tablet. I pointed a small flashlight at the tangle of red and yellow wires inside the metal housing. The new digital keypads run on a closed loop, I told him, but they still draw their primary electrical current from this tertiary relay. If you try to hack the software, the alarm will trigger. But if we temporarily reroute the physical voltage, the magnetic locks on the rear patio doors will lose their grip for exactly 60 seconds before the backup battery kicks in. Lucas nodded, his young face pale and focused in the beam of the flashlight. He spliced a small copper wire and clamped it to the relay. Give me 10 seconds to bridge the current. When the blue light on my screen turns green, you pull the heavy red wire. I grabbed the thick red wire with both hands. The rain was running into my eyes, blurring my vision. I counted the seconds in my head. 8, 9, 10. The square on Lucas's screen flashed green. I yanked the red wire hard. A soft mechanical click echoed from the direction of the house. The magnetic seal on the back doors had released, Go Lucas urged. We abandoned the junction box and sprinted across the dark, manicured lawn. My lungs burned with the effort. At 68 years old, a dead sprint through a muddy yard in the middle of a storm was a profound physical shock. But the adrenaline surging through my veins pushed the pain away. We reached the glass patio doors. I grabbed the brass handle and pulled. The heavy door glided open silently. We slipped inside the house and gently pushed the door shut behind us. Pulling the red wire from the junction box had automatically reset the circuit. A second later, the magnetic lock re-engaged with a quiet snap. We were locked inside. The sudden warmth and stillness of the house hit me like a physical blow. The air smelled of expensive vanilla candles and citrus floor cleaner. It was my home, but it felt completely alien. A pair of Greg's expensive Italian leather shoes sat carelessly by the entryway. Chloe's designer handbag was tossed onto the kitchen island. They had taken over my life in less than 12 hours. I motioned for Lucas to follow me. We moved silently down the long carpeted hallway. Every shadow felt dangerous. The house was enormous, but the silence amplified every small creak of the floorboards. We reached the heavy oak doors of Thomas's private study. I turned the brass knob and pushed the door open. The room was pitch black. The heavy velvet curtains were drawn tight against the storm outside. I did not turn on the overhead lights. I moved directly to the center of the room. I rolled back the heavy Persian rug, exposing the polished hardwood floor. I ran my fingers along the grain of the wood until I found the hidden groove. I pressed down, and a small wooden panel popped up, revealing the steel dial of the floor safe. Lucas stood guard by the door, his eyes scanning the dark hallway outside. "Hurry, Grandma," he whispered. I knelt on the floor and rested my hand on the cold steel dial. 40 years of marriage. 40 years of shared secrets and balanced ledgers. I spun the dial to the right, 32, left to 14, right to 58. The heavy internal tumblers fell into place with a heavy, satisfying clunk. I pulled the steel door upward. I reached inside the dark cavity. My fingers brushed past velvet jewelry boxes and stacks of municipal bonds until I found the thick leather portfolio. I pulled it out and opened it on the floor. I ran my thumb over the bottom corner of the first page. I felt the raised, textured ridges of the state biometric seal. This was it. The original, unalterable corporate charter for our logistics company. Without this specific physical document, Greg's forged power of attorney was completely useless. He could not sell the freight trucks. He could not liquidate the warehouses. "I got it," I whispered to Lucas. I stood up and handed him the heavy leather portfolio. "Put this in your backpack." Before Lucas could unzip his bag, the sound of heavy footsteps echoed from the marble foyer at the front of the house. The voices drifted down the hallway, growing louder with every passing second. "Did you lock the front gate?" Chloe asked. Her voice was sharp and irritated. "I locked everything," Greg replied. His words were slightly slurred. He sounded arrogant and deeply intoxicated. "Stop worrying. The old bat is probably wandering around a parking lot downtown completely out of her mind. The police will dump her in a psychiatric ward before morning." My blood ran cold. They were walking straight toward the study. Lucas's eyes darted around the dark room in a panic. He grabbed my arm. "In here," he breathed, pulling me toward the tall, narrow cedar closet in the corner of the office where Thomas used to keep his winter coats. We slipped inside the closet just as the brass knob of the study door turned. Lucas gently pulled the closet door shut, leaving the slimmest fraction of an inch open so we could breathe. The space was incredibly cramped. We were pressed shoulder to shoulder, hiding behind thick wool overcoats that smelled faintly of my late husband's cedar cologne. The bright overhead lights of the study flicked on, sending a sharp slice of yellow illumination through the crack in our closet door. I held my breath. My heart was hammering so violently against my ribs, I was certain they could hear it. Greg walked into my line of sight. He was holding a crystal tumbler half full of amber liquid. He looked disheveled. His tie was loosened and his expensive dress shirt was unbuttoned at the collar. He walked over to Thomas's heavy mahogany desk and collapsed into the leather executive chair. He kicked his feet up onto the polished wood, knocking over a framed photograph of Thomas and me. "Watch the glass," Chloe said, walking into the room behind him. She crossed her arms and leaned against the doorframe. "We need to find the physical corporate charter tonight. The buyers from Vanguard Logistics want everything finalized by tomorrow afternoon. If we do not wire the funds to the syndicate by Friday, they are going to take our house." Greg took a long swallow from his glass. He let out a harsh, bitter laugh. "Relax, Chloe. Your mother was meticulous. The charter is probably locked in a safe deposit box at her bank. And since I am now her legal conservator, the bank will hand me the contents of her box first thing in the morning." He took another drink and smiled, a dark, terrifying smile that made my stomach turn. "You have to admit, babe, the timing was absolutely perfect," Greg said. He spun gently in my husband's chair. "If your father had lived even one more month, my creditors would have broken my legs." Chloe sighed and rubbed her temples. "I still cannot believe his heart gave out so suddenly. The doctors said he had at least 6 more months. They said his condition was stable." Greg stopped spinning the chair. The smirk on his face slowly melted into an expression of cold, casual cruelty. He swirled the liquor in his glass, watching the amber liquid catch the light. "Well," Greg murmured, "hearts are funny things, especially when they stop getting the medication they need to keep beating." The silence in the study was absolute. Through the tiny crack in the closet door, I watched Chloe slowly drop her arms. She stared at her husband. Her face went entirely blank. "What did you just say?" Chloe asked. Her voice was barely a whisper. Greg took another slow sip of his drink. He did not look ashamed. He looked proud. "Those little blue pills he took every morning to regulate his blood pressure," Greg said casually. "I swapped them out 3 weeks ago. I bought a bottle of dietary supplements online. Just chalk and sugar pressed into little blue tablets. They looked exactly the same. I swapped the bottles while your mother was in the kitchen making tea. It took 3 weeks for his system to fail. Natural causes. No autopsy required. A sickening, freezing horror washed over every nerve in my body. My husband had not succumbed to his illness. My husband had been murdered. He was murdered in his own home by the man sitting in his chair. Greg had systematically poisoned him by withholding his life-saving medication. He had watched Thomas grow weaker day by day, sitting at our dining table, smiling at our faces, waiting for the fatal heart attack to strike. A primal, violent scream rose in the back of my throat. I wanted to burst out of the closet. I wanted to wrap my hands around Greg's throat and tear the life out of him. The rage was a physical fire burning inside my chest, demanding to be released. I lunged forward, pushing against the closet door. Lucas caught me, his strong arms wrapped around my shoulders from behind, pinning my arms to my sides. He pressed his face against the back of my neck. He was trembling violently, but his grip was like iron. He pulled me backward into the dark coats, restraining me with all his youthful strength. "Do not move." Lucas breathed silently against my ear. His tears were wet against my skin. "We will kill him later. We have to survive tonight." I squeezed my eyes shut. I bit down on my own lips so hard the metallic taste of blood flooded my mouth. I forced the scream back down into my lungs. I let the burning rage condense into something entirely cold and sharp. Lucas was right. If we stepped out of this closet now, Greg would realize we had heard his confession. He would kill us both and claim we were intruders. I opened my eyes and looked through the crack in the door. Chloe was staring at her husband in horror. "You killed my father," she whispered. "I saved our lives," Greg snapped, slamming his glass down on the desk. "You think the syndicate cares about your feelings? They were going to kill us, Chloe. Both of us. Your father was a stubborn old fool who refused to help us. I did what was necessary to secure the assets. You are welcome." Chloe stood frozen for a long moment. I waited for her to scream. I waited for my daughter to pick up the heavy brass lamp and strike the man who had murdered her father. Instead, she simply looked away. "We need to find the bank keys," Chloe said softly. Her voice lacked any emotion. "I will check the master bedroom. You search the guest rooms." She turned and walked out of the study. She had just accepted the murder of her own father as the cost of doing business. Greg finished his drink, stood up from the desk, and followed her out into the hallway. He left the study door wide open. The moment their footsteps faded up the grand staircase, Lucas released his grip on my shoulders. I slumped against the wall of the closet, gasping for quiet air. My heart was shattered, but my mind was completely clear. "We have to go," Lucas whispered. He zipped his backpack tight, securing the corporate charter inside. We slipped out of the closet and moved quickly toward the French doors at the back of the study. These doors led directly to the sprawling back lawn, avoiding the main hallway entirely. I reached for the brass handle and slowly turned it. The door opened with a soft click. The freezing rain instantly washed over our faces. We stepped out onto the stone patio. We were halfway across the manicured grass when a terrifying sound pierced the noise of the storm. It was a low, guttural growl. I froze in the mud. I turned my head toward the shadows near the pool house. Two massive, heavily muscled Dobermans stepped out of the darkness. Their black coats gleamed in the rain. Their teeth were bared and their eyes were locked directly on us. Greg did not just change the locks, Lucas realized with a sharp intake of breath. He bought guard dogs. The dogs let out a vicious, echoing bark and launched themselves across the lawn. They moved with terrifying speed, tearing up the wet grass as they charged straight toward us. "Run," Lucas shouted. I did not hesitate. The survival instinct overrode every aching joint in my 68-year-old body. I sprinted toward the tall wrought iron fence at the back of the property. The ground was slick with mud, making every step treacherous. I could hear the heavy paws of the Dobermans pounding against the earth right behind us, their snarling breath growing louder by the second. We reached the iron fence. It was 6 feet tall with decorative metal spikes at the top. Lucas grabbed me by the waist and hoisted me upward with all his strength. I scrambled for purchase, my ruined shoes slipping against the wet iron bars. I threw my leg over the top just as the lead dog leaped into the air. Its massive jaws snapped shut inches below my heel, tearing a shred of fabric from the hem of my black dress. I tumbled over the other side of the fence, falling hard into the overgrown brush of the public alleyway. Lucas vaulted over the iron spikes a second later, landing heavily beside me in the mud. The dogs threw themselves against the metal gate on the other side, barking furiously into the night. Lights flicked on inside the master bedroom of the estate. Greg and Chloe had heard the dogs. "Move!" I gasped, pulling myself up from the dirt. We scrambled down the dark alleyway, sliding through the mud and the debris until we reached the street where Lucas had parked his car. We threw ourselves into the front seats and slammed the doors shut. Lucas jammed the key into the ignition and sped away from the curb, leaving the estate and the barking dogs far behind us. I sat in the passenger seat, completely covered in mud, my dress torn, and my hands bleeding from the climb. But I was not focused on the pain. I was focused on the heavy backpack sitting in the back seat. We had secured the corporate charter. We had stopped the immediate sale of the company. But the war had fundamentally changed. This was no longer just a hostile takeover. This was no longer just a financial dispute between a greedy daughter and her mother. My husband had been murdered. I looked out the window at the dark, rainy city. The grieving widow inside me wanted to break apart, but the corporate auditor took control. I was going to dismantle their scheme piece by piece. I was going to strip away the fraud that protected them, secure my company, and make sure the evidence reached the people who could take their freedom. Lucas did not drive us back toward the motel we had used before. Chloe already knew I had a grandson who could help me, and Greg had enough money to hire people who could trace cameras, license plates, and card activity. We crossed the river and took a room at another cash-only roadside motel on the industrial side of town, a place with a broken vacancy sign and a parking lot full of anonymous work vans. By the time we locked the door behind us, it was nearly 4 a.m. My hands were scraped from the fence, my knees were swollen beneath the torn black dress, and mud had dried along my morning coat. I looked like exactly what Chloe wanted the world to believe. I was a disoriented elderly woman. But the leather corporate charter on the table told a different story. I had gone into enemy territory and returned with the one document Greg could not manufacture. Lucas placed his backpack on the desk and carefully removed the charter. Then he set his phone beside it. I looked at the phone. "Why is that out?" "Because I recorded them," he said. I stared at him. Lucas unlocked the screen and opened an audio file. A waveform stretched across the display almost 40 minutes long. He tapped the middle of it. Greg's voice filled the cheap motel room, muffled by layers of cedar coats, but unmistakable. "Those little blue pills he took every morning," the recording said. "I swapped them out 3 weeks ago." Lucas stopped the playback. For several seconds I could not speak. Thomas's murder was no longer only something I had heard in the dark. It now existed as evidence that could be preserved and placed in front of a homicide detective. "You recorded the entire conversation?" I asked. "From the moment they entered the study," Lucas said. "I started the recorder when I heard their footsteps. It's saved locally. No cloud connection, no account. Greg can reach. I already made 3 encrypted copies." "Good," I said, though my voice nearly failed on the word. "Do not send it yet." Lucas frowned. "Grandma, he confessed to killing Grandpa. I know exactly what he confessed to. But if we send that recording while the Silver Alert and psychiatric order are still active, Chloe's lawyer will say, 'I manipulated you, that the file is edited, that I am a paranoid woman manufacturing accusations against my caregiver.' We preserve it. We authenticate it. Then we use it when it can do maximum damage." Lucas studied my face for a moment, then nodded. He understood. Revenge was not rage. Rage was what Greg had used when debt closed around his throat. Revenge was timing. I opened the corporate charter and spread the embossed pages across the bed. The biometric clause was still intact in Article 7. My thumb traced the raised seal Thomas and I had added 5 years earlier. Greg could forge my signature, but he could not alter the paper without leaving physical evidence. That should have been enough to stop the sale. It was not enough. Lucas reopened his laptop and pulled up the files he had captured from Greg's brokerage account. I began sorting them by date instead of sender. That was how fraud revealed itself. Criminals tell stories in emails. Numbers tell the truth in sequence. At 4:17 in the morning, I found the document that changed the problem. "Stop," I said. Lucas froze with his fingers above the keyboard. "Scroll back 3 entries." I did. A financing amendment appeared on the screen. The document had been filed with a commercial collateral registry less than 6 hours after Thomas died. Greg had used the forged power of attorney and the emergency medical affidavit to represent himself as my authorized financial agent. Then he had pledged 40 freight trucks as supplemental collateral to Apex Capital Syndicate. Lucas leaned toward the screen, but his original loan was against his house, his cars, and his brokerage license. It was, I said, "This is a later collateral amendment. He must have offered the fleet tonight to keep Apex from calling the loan before the Vanguard deal closed. The amendment was clever in the ugliest possible way. Greg had listed our trucks by vehicle identification number. He had attached fabricated board minutes claiming I approved the pledge before my supposed cognitive decline became severe. He had even included a scanned copy of my forged signature. "If we walk into court with the charter," Lucas said, "we can prove he had no right to do this." Eventually, yes, but eventually was not good enough. I pointed to the filing number. A disputed lien can freeze an asset even when the underlying document is fraudulent, I explained. If the police arrest Greg today, Apex will still claim it relied on a facially valid filing. Their lawyers can tie the fleet up while everyone argues over priority agency and fraud. Our trucks could sit in a yard for months. Contracts would fail. Drivers would leave. Customers would move to competitors. We could win the case and still lose the company. Lucas's expression hardened. So we have to make Apex release the lien voluntarily. Exactly. I pulled the laptop closer and opened Greg's original loan package. The application showed a profitable brokerage business with stable recurring revenue. The numbers were absurd. Greg had reported quarterly earnings almost 4 times higher than the figures Lucas had found in his internal statements. He had submitted client receivables that did not exist. He had listed accounts that had already been closed. He had represented my freight company as a family-controlled affiliate available to support his obligations, even though he had never owned a single share. I felt something cold settle into place inside me. There it is, I said. What is fraud against them? Lucas looked from the screen to me. Greg thought Apex was his weapon, but he lied to Apex before he ever lied to Vanguard. He induced them to lend him $1.5 million using fabricated financial statements. Then he gave them collateral he did not own. He did not just defraud me, he defrauded the people he is terrified of. For the next 2 hours, I worked as I had during major fraud investigations. I built columns for dates, amounts, representations, and contradictions. I matched Greg's loan application against his real brokerage ledger, marked the fake invoices traced the invented revenue, and placed the forged collateral amendment beside the original corporate charter. Lucas verified the digital metadata. The false board minutes had been created on Greg's office computer after Thomas's funeral. The scanned signature file had been generated from an older document in my personal archive. The collateral amendment had been transmitted from Greg's brokerage network only minutes after Chloe drove me away from the cemetery reception. That timing matters, I said. Put it on the first page. Lucas typed it in. Why the first page? Because men like the people at Apex do not care that Greg betrayed his mother-in-law. They care that he lied to them. I am not going there to ask for sympathy. I am going there to show them that their borrower is a toxic asset. By sunrise, the motel desk had disappeared beneath paper. I created a clean audit summary with 3 sections. First, Greg's actual insolvency. Second, the fabricated revenue used to obtain the loan. Third, the forged collateral filing against my fleet. At the bottom, I wrote the consequence in plain language if Apex continued relying on a lien obtained through documented fraud. After receiving notice of that fraud, it would expose itself to a federal investigation alongside Greg. Lucas read the final page twice. You are threatening them. No, I said. I am giving them a choice before the government gives them one. He leaned back and rubbed his exhausted eyes. And what do you want in return? A signed release of every lien against my freight fleet. Immediately. No conditions. He let out a low breath. And if they refuse, then the evidence goes to federal investigators, Vanguard's legal department, and every regulator with jurisdiction over Greg's brokerage business. Apex can explain why it continued trying to seize property after being shown that the collateral was stolen. These people are not normal bankers, Lucas warned. Neither am I. I gathered the evidence into a thick red folder and placed the original charter in a separate waterproof portfolio. The audio recording of Greg's confession stayed with Lucas. Murder and finance were now 2 separate weapons. I would not confuse them by firing both at once. There was one more problem. The court order, Lucas said before I could speak. I nodded. Chloe had built her entire attack around the claim that I was mentally incompetent. Even if I destroyed the lien, she could still walk into court and ask a judge to erase my legal capacity. So while I prepared the audit, Lucas used the burner phone to contact Robert Carlyle, the corporate litigator I had trusted for years. We did not give him a long explanation over an unsecured line. I told him only that a forged power of attorney, a fraudulent medical affidavit, and an emergency conservatorship petition were being used to seize my property. Robert did not waste time asking whether I was certain. He arranged a formal cognitive and toxicology evaluation at St. Jude Medical Center for late that night, followed by 2 independent psychiatric evaluations. Chloe had spent 3 months manufacturing a story about my mind. Robert wanted objective medical evidence ready before any permanent conservatorship hearing could be completed. Good, I told him. Keep the appointments quiet. Lucas checked the time. That gives us the day to deal with Apex. Exactly. You preserve the digital evidence and prepare certified copies. I take the audit to the lender. Tonight we prove I am competent. We do not need comfort. We need proof. Before we left, I looked once at the motel mirror. My husband had been buried less than a day earlier. My daughter had abandoned me, and my son-in-law had murdered Thomas, stolen my identity, and placed a lien on our company. I should have looked defeated. Instead, I looked precise. I sealed the torn mourning clothes in a bag as evidence and changed into a sharp navy suit bought with cash. Lucas handed me the red audit folder. Every digital exhibit is duplicated, he said. The charter stays with you. The murder recording stays with me. Good. Where are you going now? I looked toward the downtown skyline. Somewhere among those glass towers, Apex Capital believed it owned my trucks. I am going to correct their books, I said. Lucas gave me a grim smile. I tucked the red folder under my arm and walked toward the waiting cab. Greg had tried to turn predatory lenders into a blade at my throat. He had forgotten a basic rule of fraud: the moment you lie to two different predators, each one becomes evidence against the other. Apex was about to learn exactly what Greg had sold them. The glass doors of Apex Capital Syndicate looked like the entrance to a legitimate private wealth management firm. Located on the 42nd floor of a sleek downtown high-rise, the lobby was an intimidating expanse of white marble brushed steel and expensive abstract art. It was designed to make you feel small. It was designed to make desperate men like my son-in-law hand over everything they owned. I walked up to the reception desk wearing a sharp navy business suit I had purchased with cash just 2 hours earlier. My silver hair was pulled back into a severe, flawless twist. I did not look like a confused, wandering widow who had supposedly lost her mind. I looked exactly like what I was, a senior corporate auditor who had come to collect. The young woman behind the massive marble desk looked up from her computer screen. She offered a polite, deeply rehearsed smile. "Welcome to Apex Capital. Do you have an appointment with one of our managing directors?" "I do not have an appointment," I replied. My voice was calm and projected absolute authority. "I am here to see the head of underwriting. Tell him Helen is here to discuss the $1.5 million toxic exposure his department just absorbed from a broker named Greg." The receptionist blinked. Her polished smile faltered for a fraction of a second. "I am sorry, ma'am, but we do not accept walk-in visitors. If you would like to leave your contact information, I can have an associate reach out to you." I placed both of my hands flat on the cold marble of her desk. I leaned forward slightly. "I highly recommend you pick up your phone," I told her. "Tell your head of underwriting that Greg fabricated his profit margins by 400% on his commercial loan application. Tell him the collateral Greg pledged against that loan is actively compromised by a forged power of attorney. If your firm attempts to execute the lien on Friday morning, you will be committing a federal offense. Now make the call." The receptionist stared at me. Her eyes darted toward the large man standing by the elevator banks. The security guard immediately noticed her distress and began walking toward us. He was a heavily muscled man wearing a tailored suit that could not hide his bulk. He looked like the kind of muscle predatory lenders kept on payroll for clients who refused to pay. "Ma'am," the security guard said, stopping 2 feet away from me, "I am going to have to ask you to step back from the desk." I did not break eye contact with the receptionist. "Call him," I repeated softly. "Tell him the word wire fraud." The receptionist swallowed hard and picked up her desk phone. She pressed a single button, spoke in a hushed whisper for a moment, and then paused, listening to the voice on the other end. She slowly placed the receiver back on the cradle. "Mr. Thorne will see you," she said. Her voice was noticeably shaken. She gestured to the security guard. "Escort her to the corner office." The guard nodded, his hostile demeanor shifting into cautious confusion. He led me down a long, silent hallway lined with frosted glass doors. The air smelled of expensive leather and polished wood. There were no voices echoing from the rooms, no sounds of ringing phones or busy printers. Apex Capital operated in the shadows of the financial sector, moving silent money to desperate people. We reached the heavy oak doors at the end of the corridor. The guard opened one of the doors and gestured for me to step inside. Victor Thorne was sitting behind an enormous mahogany desk. He looked to be in his late 50s, with sharp features, silver hair, and a dark tailored suit. He possessed the quiet, terrifying stillness of a man who was entirely accustomed to destroying people's lives for profit. He did not stand when I entered. He simply gestured to the leather chair opposite his desk. "Have a seat," Helen Victor said. His voice was smooth and gravelly. I did not sit down. I remained standing, clutching my leather portfolio. In negotiations involving hostile parties, at a psychological disadvantage. You surrender your physical leverage. I prefer to stand, I told him. Victor leaned back in his chair. He studied my face, his dark eyes analyzing every detail of my appearance. You are Greg's mother-in-law, the grieving widow. Greg informed us that you were suffering from severe cognitive decline. He said you were completely disconnected from reality. You look remarkably coherent to me. Greg is a mediocre liar and a worse investment broker, I replied. He tells people what they want to hear so he can secure capital he cannot afford to repay. I am here to discuss the balloon loan you authorized for him. Victor chuckled softly. It was a cold, humorless sound. I see. You are here to play the protective mother. You want to negotiate an extension. You want me to give your son-in-law a little more time to come up with the money so he does not lose his house. I am afraid I do not run a charity, Helen. Greg signed the contract. The terms are absolute. I am not here to ask for an extension, Mr. Thorne. I am here to tell you that the collateral securing your loan does not exist. I opened my leather portfolio and pulled out a stack of documents I had printed at the local library earlier that morning. I walked forward and dropped the papers directly onto the center of his immaculate desk. Victor frowned. He picked up the first few pages and scanned them. His eyes narrowed as he processed the numbers. What is this? He demanded. That is a forensic audit of Greg's brokerage firm, I explained, keeping my voice perfectly steady. I compiled it myself last night. As you can clearly see on page 4, Greg completely fabricated his corporate revenue streams on the loan application he submitted to your firm. He inflated his quarterly margins by over 400%. He generated fake client invoices to make his business look solvent. Victor flipped through the pages, his expression hardening into a mask of pure anger. He lied on a federal financial document. Yes, he did, I agreed. But that is not your biggest problem. Your biggest problem is the collateral he pledged to secure your money. Turn to page 7. Victor turned the page. He stared at the printout detailing the assets of my freight logistics company. Greg pledged my entire fleet of commercial transport trucks as collateral against your loan, I continued. He used a document granting him power of attorney to authorize the pledge. But Greg forged my signature on that power of attorney. He committed identity theft to leverage my company. Victor set the papers down. He looked up at me. The smug arrogance had completely vanished from his face. If this is true, he said quietly, the lien we placed on those trucks is legally void. It is worse than void, I corrected him. It is highly toxic. Greg is actively attempting to sell my logistics company to Vanguard tomorrow to pay you back. If your firm attempts to collect the proceeds of that sale, or if you attempt to seize my fleet on Friday morning, my legal team will instantly file an injunction in federal court. I took a step closer to his desk, letting the full weight of my corporate experience command the room. I will hand these audit documents directly to the Federal Bureau of Investigation, I told him. I will report Greg for massive wire fraud and identity theft. And because your firm authorized a fraudulent lien against my business, the federal authorities will drag Apex Capital into the center of the investigation. The government will freeze your operational accounts for years. Your private investors will panic. Your entire syndicate will be subjected to a relentless, miserable government audit. Victor remained absolutely silent. His jaw was clenched tight. He was a predator, but he was also a businessman. He recognized a catastrophic liability when it was placed right in front of him. You are threatening to burn my firm to the ground, Victor said slowly. I am simply balancing the ledger, I replied. My son-in-law dragged your firm into a criminal conspiracy without your knowledge. I am offering you a way to walk away clean. What do you want? Victor demanded. I want you to release the lien on my logistics fleet immediately, I stated. I want you to void the claim against my corporate assets today. If I release the lien on those trucks, Greg has no collateral left to cover the $1.5 million he owes me, Victor argued. His voice rose with anger. I am not absorbing a total loss just because you threatened me with an audit. I am not asking you to absorb a loss, I told him. I reached into my portfolio and pulled out a secondary stack of papers. I placed them next to the first pile. I am offering you a trade. Victor looked at the new documents. What is this? That is the unredacted evidence proving Greg committed deliberate wire fraud to secure your capital, I explained. It includes the routing numbers of his hidden personal accounts. It includes the actual uninflated deeds to his personal estate and his luxury vehicles. I met his gaze with absolute unblinking focus. Release the lien on my company today, I said. In exchange, I give you the perfect legal weapon to destroy him. You can use this evidence to immediately seize his personal home, freeze his hidden cash, and revoke his brokerage license. You recoup your capital directly from his private assets. You do it completely legally, and you get to throw him in federal prison for wire fraud as a bonus. You preserve your money, and you avoid the federal investigation entirely. Victor stared at the documents. He picked up the evidence file and reviewed the routing numbers and the property deeds. I watched the calculation happening in his mind. He was weighing the risks. He knew that fighting me in federal court over a forged power of attorney would cost his firm millions in legal fees and potentially expose their darker lending practices to the government. But taking the evidence I provided gave him a direct, clean path to destroying Greg and recovering his money without drawing unwanted attention. "You are a very ruthless woman," Helen Victor said softly. He closed the folder and rested his hands on top of it. "Your daughter and her husband chose the wrong victim. Do we have a deal?" I asked. Victor pressed a button on his desk phone. "Have the legal department draft a total release of the lien on the logistics fleet belonging to Helen," he commanded his assistant. "Bring the paperwork to my office immediately." He released the button and looked back at me. "I will release your fleet," Victor told me, "but you need to understand something. I am letting you walk out of this building because you gave me a clean path to my money. But Greg is a desperate man. If you push him into a corner, he will fight like a cornered animal." "I appreciate the warning," I replied. Victor signed the release documents 10 minutes later. He slid the heavy, embossed paper across the mahogany desk. I reviewed the signature carefully, verifying the legal terminology. The lien was officially dissolved. My fleet of freight trucks was safe from the syndicate. "You have exactly 24 hours to finish whatever game you are playing with your son-in-law." Victor warned me as I turned toward the door. "If this federal evidence you gave me is not actionable by tomorrow afternoon, I will come after your business anyway, and I will not care about the FBI." 24 hours is more than enough time," I assured him. I walked out of the executive suite down the long corridor and out through the marble lobby. The security guard did not look at me. The receptionist kept her eyes glued to her monitor. I pushed through the glass revolving doors and stepped back out onto the busy downtown street. The storm from yesterday had passed, leaving the city air feeling damp and cold. I walked 2 blocks away from the Apex Capitol building before pulling the burner phone from my coat pocket. I turned it on and dialed Lucas's number. He picked up immediately. "Did you get the release?" Lucas asked. His voice was breathless with anxiety. "I have the paperwork in my hand," I confirmed. "The syndicate has dropped the lien. Our trucks are secure. Now we just need to handle Chloe and Greg." "Grandma, we have a massive problem," Lucas said. The panic in his voice made my chest tighten. "I just intercepted a digital filing from the county courthouse." Aunt Chloe did not wait for the standard evaluation period. "What did she do?" I demanded. "She bribed the judge," Lucas explained rapidly. "The judge who signed the emergency psychiatric order just fast-tracked the permanent conservatorship hearing. They moved it to the top of the docket. The hearing is scheduled for tomorrow morning at 8 o'clock. I stopped walking. The busy sounds of city traffic seemed to fade away. "Tomorrow morning," I repeated. "Yes," Lucas said. "Chloe and Greg are going to stand in front of that corrupt judge and finalize your mental incompetence ruling in absentia. If the judge bangs that gavel at 8 o'clock, you lose all your human rights. You become a legal ghost. Chloe will take total control of the estate, and the deal you just made with the syndicate will not matter because you will no longer exist on paper." A cold, heavy silence stretched between us on the phone line. Chloe had accelerated the timeline. She knew the window to sell the company was closing. She wanted to lock me in a legal cage before I could fight back. "Pick me up at the corner of 5th and Main," I told my grandson. My voice was stripped of any fear. It was nothing but cold, absolute determination. "What are we going to do?" Lucas asked. "We are going to go to court," I said. "We are going to show the judge exactly how competent I am." The air inside Department 4 of the county courthouse smelled of lemon floor polish and impending theft. The heavy mahogany walls were designed to project justice, but today they were simply the backdrop for a hostile takeover. I stood in the marble hallway just outside the heavy double doors, listening to the muffled voice of my daughter echoing from the courtroom speakers. Chloe was putting on the performance of a lifetime. Her voice wavered with perfectly calibrated sorrow. She was weeping, telling the judge how her beloved mother had lost her mind. She painted a tragic picture of a woman wandering away from her own husband's funeral, confused and dangerously paranoid. I listened as she sobbed, detailing fabricated stories of me leaving the stove on, forgetting my own address, and speaking to people who were not there. Beside me in the hallway stood Lucas. He was holding a thick red leather briefcase. On my other side stood Robert Carlyle. Robert was a senior corporate litigator I had kept on retainer for the past 15 years. He was a tall, sharply dressed man with silver hair and a reputation for completely destroying his opponents in the courtroom. I had called him from the motel room late last night. He had worked until dawn to gather the ammunition we needed. Through the narrow glass window of the courtroom door, I could see Greg. He was sitting at the petitioner's table, rubbing Chloe's back in a display of false husbandly support. But I noticed the way his foot tapped frantically against the carpet. I noticed how he kept checking the heavy gold watch on his wrist. He did not care about Chloe's tears. He cared about the clock. He needed the judge to sign that conservatorship order so he could run straight to the corporate boardroom and sell my logistics company before his loan defaulted. Their lawyer, a sleazy man named Simon Reed, stood up to address the bench. "Your Honor," Simon said smoothly, "the medical affidavit provided by Dr. Aris is absolutely conclusive. Helen is suffering from advanced cognitive decline. She is a danger to herself and her estate. Given her current missing status, we ask that you grant my clients full and immediate conservatorship so they can protect her assets and authorize her psychiatric care the moment she is located." Judge Miller sat high on the bench looking down at the paperwork. We knew from Lucas's digital digging that Judge Miller had a history of fast-tracking shady estate transfers. He had likely received a very generous envelope of cash from Greg to push this hearing through without waiting for the standard waiting periods. The judge picked up his pen. He adjusted his glasses and looked down at Chloe with a sympathetic nod. "This is a tragic situation," Judge Miller said, his voice echoing through the quiet room. "Given the compelling medical evidence and the active missing persons alert, I am prepared to grant emergency conservatorship to the petitioners." He lowered his pen to the thick stack of legal documents. I looked at Robert. He gave me a single sharp nod. I pushed the heavy oak doors open. They hit the rubber stoppers on the back wall with a resounding, violent crack that echoed like a gunshot. Every head in the courtroom snapped toward the back of the room. The bailiff instinctively reached for his belt. The court reporter stopped typing. I stepped over the threshold and walked down the center aisle. I was not wearing the mud-stained morning dress from yesterday. I was wearing a sharp charcoal gray designer suit. My silver hair was styled into a flawless twist. My posture was perfectly straight. I walked with the measured, terrifying confidence of a senior corporate auditor stepping into a boardroom to fire a fraudulent executive. Chloe gasped. She shot up from her chair, her hands flying to her mouth. The fake tears instantly vanished, replaced by a look of sheer, unadulterated horror. Greg froze. His mouth fell open. He stared at me as if a ghost had just walked out of the grave and into the courthouse. "Your Honor." Robert Carlyle's voice boomed across the room as he strode down the aisle beside me. He possessed a commanding baritone that instantly seized control of the space. "I believe signing that order would be a catastrophic legal error. My client Helen is fully competent, entirely present, and absolutely prepared to address the court." Chloe recovered her senses quickly. She rushed out from behind the petitioner table, throwing her arms open in a desperate attempt to salvage her narrative. "Mom," she cried out, running toward me. "Oh my God, you are safe. We have been terrified. Where have you been?" She reached out to grab my shoulders. I did not step back. I did not flinch. I simply raised my right hand and held it flat between us. The gesture was so cold and absolute that Chloe stopped dead in her tracks, inches away from me. "Do not touch me, Chloe," I said. My voice was quiet, but it carried perfectly through the silent room. "You left me in the mud on a logging road. You stole my purse. Your performance is over. Take your seat." Chloe blinked, her face flushing crimson. She looked at the judge, trying to maintain her victim persona. "Your Honor, she is delusional. You can hear it. She does not know what she is saying. I suggest you return to your table, Mrs. Vance," Judge Miller said. He looked deeply uncomfortable. He set his pen down, realizing his quiet, paid-off hearing had just become a massive public liability. Chloe retreated to Greg's side. Greg was gripping the edge of the table so tightly his knuckles were white. "Mr. Carlyle," the judge said, clearing his throat, "this is a highly irregular disruption. The court has a sworn medical affidavit stating your client is suffering from severe cognitive impairment." Robert smiled. It was the kind of smile a shark gives right before it bites. "With all due respect, Your Honor, the affidavit provided by opposing counsel is a complete fabrication." Robert stated. He stepped up to the defense table and opened the red leather briefcase Lucas handed him. He pulled out 3 thick-bound folders and slapped them onto the polished wood. What you have before you is a piece of paper signed by a physician who has not examined my client in over 4 years, Robert continued. In fact, we have banking records showing a rather substantial cash transfer from Greg's personal account to that specific doctor just 2 days ago. We have already forwarded those transaction records to the State Medical Board for a fraud investigation. Simon Reed, the sleazy opposing lawyer, jumped to his feet. Objection. This is outrageous. You cannot introduce unverified financial claims into this hearing without proper discovery. I do not need to introduce financial claims to prove my point, Robert fired back without missing a beat. I have physiological proof. Robert grabbed the first folder and walked it directly up to the judge's bench. Your Honor, late last night, my client checked herself into the emergency room at St. Jude Medical Center, Robert explained. She submitted to a comprehensive battery of cognitive and physiological exams. What you are looking at is a sworn, notarized psychiatric evaluation conducted just 8 hours ago by Dr. Harrison Vance, the chief of neurology at St. Jude. I watched Judge Miller open the folder. His eyes scanned the heavy black text. Furthermore, Robert continued, his voice ringing with absolute authority. We did not stop at one opinion. We brought in 2 additional independent board-certified psychiatrists to conduct secondary evaluations. Their findings are included in tabs B and C. All 3 medical professionals concluded uniformly and without hesitation that Helen possesses 0 signs of dementia, 0 signs of cognitive decline, and possesses a mental acuity that frankly surpasses most people half her age. Greg leaned over and whispered frantically into his lawyer's ear. Simon looked panicked. Your Honor. Simon stammered. A late-night hospital visit does not invalidate a long-term pattern of decline. My clients have witnessed her paranoia for months. Robert let out a sharp, dismissive laugh. Oh, I am so glad you brought up paranoia, counselor, because we also ran a full toxicology screen. Robert walked back to the table and pulled a single sheet of paper from the briefcase. He held it up for the entire room to see. My client suspected that her son-in-law might attempt to drug her to fabricate symptoms of confusion, Robert stated. He looked directly at Greg. The toxicology report shows 0 trace of any cognitive impairing substances in her bloodstream. She is completely clean. She is completely sane. The only thing she is suffering from is a coordinated criminal attempt by her own family to steal her assets. Chloe covered her face with her hands. She was genuinely shaking now, realizing the trap had completely reversed. I stepped forward. I did not look at my daughter or her husband. I looked directly at the judge. Your Honor, I said, keeping my tone perfectly measured. I am a retired corporate auditor. I spent 40 years identifying financial fraud. When my husband passed away, my son-in-law realized his own brokerage firm was failing. He needed to seize my logistics company to pay off a massive private debt. I and my daughter orchestrated this entire spectacle to strip me of my legal rights so they could sell my life's work. Judge Miller stared at me. He looked down at the 3 independent psychiatric evaluations, the toxicology report, and the confident, sharply dressed woman standing before him. He knew he was beaten. If he pushed this conservatorship through now, Robert Carlyle would bury him in appeals and judicial review boards. The bribe money was not worth losing his pension. I submit to the court, Robert added, leaning on the defense table, that the petition for conservatorship is completely baseless, demonstrably fraudulent, and borders on criminal conspiracy. We ask that this petition be dismissed immediately with prejudice. Simon Reed tried to salvage the situation. Your Honor, we request a continuance to review these new medical documents. Request denied, Judge Miller snapped. He practically threw the fake medical affidavit across his desk. The court finds the independent medical evaluations provided by defense counsel to be overwhelmingly conclusive. There is absolutely no legal or medical basis for a conservatorship in this matter. He picked up his wooden gavel. He did not look at Greg or Chloe. This petition is dismissed with prejudice, the judge declared. The gavel struck the sounding block with a sharp, final crack. We are adjourned. The sound of that gavel was the sweetest noise I had ever heard. It was the sound of my life returning to my control. I turned slowly to face the petitioner's table. Simon Reed was already shoving his papers into his briefcase, refusing to look at his own clients. He knew he was dangerously close to facing a Bar Association inquiry for presenting fraudulent documents. Chloe was staring at the floor. All the color had drained from her face. She looked like a child who had just been caught stealing, terrified of the punishment that was about to follow. But Greg was not looking at the judge, and he was not looking at me. He was looking at his gold watch. It was 9:15 in the morning. I watched the realization hit him like a physical blow. The judge had dismissed the case. Greg did not have conservatorship. The fraudulent power of attorney was his only remaining weapon, and he still believed it was enough to sell the company. He just needed to finish the sale before I could get to the corporate office to stop him. He grabbed Chloe by the arm, pulling her roughly out of her chair. "We are leaving," Greg hissed. "We have a meeting to get to." He practically dragged her down the center aisle, pushing past Lucas without a word. They burst through the heavy oak doors, sprinting toward the courthouse parking lot. "They are going to the corporate headquarters," Lucas said. He stepped up beside me, watching the doors swing shut. "Greg thinks he can still sell the logistics company to Vanguard. He thinks if he gets the corporate buyers to sign the transfer agreement right now, he can wire the money to his creditors before the courts can stop him." Robert Carlyle began packing his legal files back into the red briefcase. He looked at me with a calm, professional smile. "Should I call the local authorities to intercept them at the boardroom?" "No," I replied. I smoothed the lapels of my charcoal suit. "If we send the police now, Greg will claim it was a simple misunderstanding about the paperwork. I do not want him arrested for a misunderstanding. I want him caught in the act of executing a multi-million-dollar federal wire fraud." I looked at Lucas. "Did you bring the red folder?" Lucas patted the side of his backpack. "I have it right here, the original documents from the floor safe." "Excellent," I said. "Let them drive to the headquarters. Let Greg sit at the head of my boardroom table. Let him pour the champagne and shake hands with the Vanguard executives. Let him feel the absolute thrill of victory right up until the exact moment he signs his name on that fraudulent transfer agreement." I turned and began walking down the aisle toward the courthouse exit. My heels clicked rhythmically against the polished marble floor. "We are going to the office," I told them. "It is time to show my son-in-law exactly how a blind trust works." The rain had finally stopped, leaving the city streets slick and black under the afternoon sun. Inside the leather interior of their leased sports car, panic was suffocating my daughter and her husband. Greg drove with a reckless, terrifying speed, weaving through the thick downtown traffic. Chloe sat beside him, her hands trembling so violently she could barely hold her phone. The catastrophic failure at the courthouse had shattered their carefully constructed illusion. The corrupt judge had dismissed their psychiatric petition. I was legally competent. I was free. But a desperate man is a dangerous man, and Greg was out of time. He gripped the steering wheel, his knuckles white. The massive debt he owed the predatory lending syndicate was due in less than 24 hours. Without the medical injunction, his only remaining weapon was the forged power of attorney. He firmly believed that single piece of paper still gave him the absolute legal authority to liquidate my life's work. He just needed to finalize the transaction before my lawyers could file an injunction to freeze the corporate assets. They pulled into the reserved parking garage of our freight logistics headquarters. Thomas and I had built this company from a single rusted delivery truck into a sprawling regional empire. The towering glass building stood as a monument to 4 decades of blood, sweat, and relentless audits. It was a fortress of industry. Now my own daughter was rushing inside to tear it down and sell the pieces to the highest bidder. Greg and Chloe hurried into the executive elevator, swiping a stolen access card to reach the top floor. The corporate boardroom was a cavernous space designed to project power and stability. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a panoramic view of our primary distribution yards, where dozens of 18-wheelers hummed with activity. Inside the room, the atmosphere was thick with predatory anticipation. Sitting around the polished mahogany table were 4 senior executives from Vanguard Logistics, a massive national conglomerate that had been trying to buy us out for years. At the center of the table sat a silver ice bucket chilling 2 bottles of expensive champagne. The Vanguard representatives wore tailored suits and practiced easy smiles. They thought they were securing a massive fleet of trucks and 3 lucrative warehouses for an absolute steal. Greg had offered them the entire company for $15 million, a fraction of its actual market value. The discount was his primary leverage to ensure a fast, unquestioned cash transfer. Greg burst through the heavy oak doors, pulling Chloe behind him. He forced a wide, charismatic smile onto his sweating face. He buttoned his suit jacket, trying to project the image of a confident executive finalizing a routine merger. "I apologize for the delay, gentlemen," Greg announced, his voice echoing slightly in the large room. "We had a minor legal technicality to resolve regarding my mother-in-law's ongoing medical care, but the path is completely clear. We are ready to close." The lead Vanguard executive, a sharp-featured man named Marcus, stood up and extended his hand. "We are glad to hear the family matters are settled, Greg. Our legal department has reviewed the power of attorney you provided. Given the circumstances of Helen's declining health, the document appears sufficient to authorize you as the primary signatory for this asset transfer." Greg pumped Marcus's hand vigorously. "It is a tragic situation, but liquidating the company will ensure Helen receives the specialized psychiatric facility care she requires. Now, do we have the final contracts?" A junior lawyer from Vanguard slid a thick, leather-bound portfolio across the polished table. He opened it to the last page, revealing a cluster of signature lines marked with red flags. "The $15 million has already been transferred into a secure escrow account," the lawyer explained. His tone was brisk and professional. "Once you sign the transfer agreement as the authorized proxy, the funds will be released instantly into your designated personal holding account. The corporate structure of the logistics company will officially transfer to Vanguard." Chloe sank into a leather chair next to her husband. She stared at the thick stack of papers. The money would save them. It would pay off the syndicate, erase their debts, and leave them with millions to spare. She looked at Greg, her eyes silently urging him to hurry. Greg reached into the breast pocket of his jacket and pulled out a heavy gold fountain pen. He uncapped it with a loud metallic click. The nib hovered just an inch above the crisp white paper. He took a deep breath, steadying his shaking hand. He was seconds away from stealing my 40-year legacy. Outside the glass walls of the boardroom, the executive floor was entirely silent. The administrative assistants were working at their desks down the hall. The security guards were patrolling the ground floor lobby. Greg thought he had isolated himself perfectly. He believed he had outrun the consequences of his actions. Then a soft, melodic chime rang out through the quiet hallway. It was the distinctive sound of the private executive elevator arriving at the top floor. Chloe jerked her head toward the frosted glass doors of the boardroom. Her breath caught in her throat. The heavy steel doors of the elevator slid open with a smooth mechanical hum. Footsteps began walking down the corridor. They were not the rushed, panicked steps of a confused old woman. They were slow, deliberate, and commanded absolute authority. Greg froze. The gold pen remained suspended in the air, a drop of black ink threatening to fall onto the signature line. "Who is that?" Greg muttered. He glared at Chloe. "Did you fail to lock down the elevator, Banks?" "I locked everything," Chloe whispered. Her voice was trembling. "Only board members have the security clearance to call that car." The brass handles of the boardroom doors turned downward simultaneously. The heavy oak panels swung open, revealing the brightly lit hallway beyond. I stepped into the room. I was not wearing the mud-stained clothes from yesterday. I was wearing a sharp charcoal gray designer suit. My silver hair was pinned back flawlessly. My posture was perfectly straight. I walked with the terrifying, unyielding confidence of a senior corporate auditor stepping into a room to terminate a fraudulent executive. Lucas walked in right behind me. He was wearing a dark jacket, carrying his heavy black backpack over one shoulder. He stood by my side, radiating a quiet, protective strength. The atmosphere in the boardroom instantly shattered. The polite corporate etiquette evaporated, replaced by an electric, suffocating tension. The Vanguard executives turned in their chairs. Marcus stared at me in complete shock. He had spent the entire morning listening to Greg describe me as a confused, babbling invalid who did not know her own name. Yet the woman standing before him looked sharper and more dangerous than anyone else in the room, Helen, Marcus said. He stood up slowly, instinctively, buttoning his suit jacket out of a deep-seated professional respect. "We were explicitly told you were confined to a secured medical facility." I ignored Marcus entirely. My eyes were locked completely on my son-in-law. Greg was staring at me with a look of pure, primal panic. His hand was shaking so badly he dropped the gold fountain pen. It clattered against the mahogany table and rolled onto the carpet. His grand, flawless plan was crumbling right in front of his eyes. "What are you doing here?" Greg demanded. His voice was loud and defensive, an obvious attempt to mask his terror with anger. "You are not supposed to be in this building." "I work here, Greg," I replied calmly. I took a slow, measured step into the room. "I own the chair you are sitting in. I own the table you are leaning on. I own the trucks parked in the lot outside. The real question is why you are attempting to sell my property to my competitors without my permission." Chloe leaped to her feet. She pointed a trembling finger at me. "She is delusional," Chloe shouted to the Vanguard executives. "Do not listen to a single word she says." She wandered away from her caregivers. "She does not understand what is happening right now." Lucas stepped forward. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a thick stack of papers. He tossed them onto the center of the table, right on top of the acquisition contracts. "Those are 3 independent psychiatric evaluations conducted less than 12 hours ago," Lucas announced. His young voice was remarkably firm and carried no hesitation. "They are signed by the chief of neurology at St. Jude Medical Center and 2 board-certified psychiatrists. They certify that my grandmother is in perfect cognitive health. The emergency conservatorship petition you filed this morning was dismissed by a judge with prejudice. You have absolutely no medical or legal authority over her life." Marcus picked up the medical documents. He scanned the official hospital letterhead and the signatures. He looked at Greg, his eyes narrowing with deep, dangerous suspicion. "Is this true?" Marcus asked. His tone was freezing cold. "Did you submit fraudulent medical claims to broker this corporate acquisition?" Greg's face turned a mottled shade of red. He realized he was losing control of the buyers. He slammed both of his hands flat onto the mahogany table. "It does not matter," Greg shouted. He pointed wildly at the forged document sitting next to the transfer agreement. "I have a valid notarized power of attorney. It grants me total administrative control over her financial portfolio and her corporate holdings. I am the legal proxy. Her mental state is completely irrelevant. The power of attorney gives me the absolute right to sign this contract." He looked around the room, breathing heavily. He was trying to project dominance, but he just looked like a desperate, cornered animal. He glared at me with absolute hatred. "Security!" Greg yelled toward the open doorway. "Someone get security up here right now. Remove this confused old woman from the building. She is trespassing on a closed corporate meeting." I did not flinch. I did not raise my voice. I simply walked over to the nearest leather chair and rested my hands on the back of it. "You can scream for security all you want, Greg," I told him quietly. "But the guards downstairs have worked for my husband and me for over 20 years. They know exactly who signs their paychecks. They will not lift a single finger against me." Greg snatched his gold pen off the floor. He leaned over the table and glared at the Vanguard executives. "We are finishing this right now," Greg ordered them. "I am signing the transfer agreement. You are going to wire the $15 million to my account, and you are going to take the keys to the freight fleet. If she tries to sue you later, my power of attorney will protect you in court. Now process the transaction." Marcus looked at the pen in Greg's hand. He looked at the forged power of attorney. Then he looked at me. Vanguard wanted my logistics company desperately, but they were also a publicly traded corporation. They could not afford the public relations nightmare of participating in a fraudulent hostile takeover, Helen Marcus said carefully. He was trying to navigate the explosive situation without entirely losing the lucrative deal. "He has presented us with a legally binding proxy document. If he signs this contract, it creates a very complicated legal reality for your business." I looked at Marcus with a quiet, profound sense of pity. "It does not create a complicated reality at all," Marcus, I replied smoothly, "because Greg is holding a completely useless piece of paper." Greg let out a mocking, arrogant laugh. "It is legally notarized, Helen. It gives me the right to sell your shares. You cannot stop me from signing this." I turned my gaze back to my son-in-law. I watched the greedy, desperate anticipation burning in his eyes. He truly believed he had won. He believed that his forgery had granted him the keys to the kingdom. He thought the heavy doors of the boardroom would protect him from the consequences of his betrayal. I felt a cold, deep satisfaction settle into my bones. It was the exact feeling I always experienced when I finally trapped a corrupt executive in a web of their own financial lies. The moment of the final audit had arrived. I took another step closer to the table, forcing him to look directly into my eyes. I wanted him to see the absolute certainty in my gaze. I wanted him to recognize that he had made a fatal miscalculation. "I am going to stop you, Greg," I said softly, ensuring every single person in the room heard my words, and I'm going to do it without calling the police. Chloe backed away from the table, her hands clutching her designer purse. Her eyes darted from me to the Vanguard executives, realizing her husband was rapidly losing his grip on the situation. The multi-million-dollar lifeline they desperately needed was slipping through their fingers. The silence that followed was heavy and absolute. It was the kind of silence that happens right before a massive structure collapses. I stood tall, smoothing the front of my jacket. I was ready to deliver the final blow. I was ready to show them exactly what happens when you try to steal from a woman who built the ledger. Greg gripped the pen so tightly his knuckles cracked. He lowered the nib toward the paper, but his hand was shaking too violently to make a mark. He looked at me, searching for any sign of bluffing. He found none. The trap they had built for me had just snapped shut on their own throats. They just did not know it yet. They were about to learn the most painful lesson of the financial world. You never bet your life against a master auditor. The mahogany table in the center of the boardroom was polished to a perfect mirror finish. It reflected the terrified, sweating face of my son-in-law. Greg was holding his expensive gold fountain pen, like a weapon, but a weapon is completely useless when your target refuses to flinch. He had demanded security. He had screamed for the guards to remove me from the building, yet nobody came to his rescue. The heavy oak doors remained closed behind us. The silence in the room was absolute, broken only by the sound of rain lashing against the floor-to-ceiling glass windows. I did not yell. I did not berate my daughter for leaving me to die in the freezing mud. Anger is an unpredictable liability. I preferred cold, calculated control. I walked slowly toward the opposite end of the massive table. My designer suit was perfectly pressed. My silver hair was immaculate. I moved with the terrifying, unyielding confidence of a senior corporate auditor who had just cornered a thief. Lucas stood faithfully at my side. He unzipped his heavy black backpack and reached inside. He did not pull out a weapon or a threatening device. He pulled out a single, thick manila folder. The document was bound with a thick crimson cord and stamped with a bright red legal seal from the state registry. He handed it to me. I placed the folder gently onto the center of the polished wood. The dull thud of the thick cardboard hitting the table echoed through the cavernous boardroom like a judge bringing down a final gavel. I looked directly at Marcus, the lead executive for Vanguard Logistics. He was standing rigidly by his chair, his eyes darting between Greg and the red folder. "Before you authorize a $15 million wire transfer, Marcus, I highly suggest you read the document inside that red folder," I said. My voice carried perfectly across the long room. "Because the man sitting across from you is trying to sell you a ghost." Greg slammed his fist onto the table. The sudden violence of his movement made his own wife jump in her seat. "Do not listen to her," Greg shouted at the Vanguard executives. "She is legally incompetent. My power of attorney supersedes anything she puts on this table. I am the authorized signatory. We are closing this deal right now." I ignored my son-in-law entirely. I kept my eyes locked on the corporate buyers. They were businessmen. They understood risk. And right now, I was introducing a catastrophic liability into their perfect acquisition. 3 months before my husband died, I noticed a minor irregularity in our operational ledgers, I told the room. It was a very small discrepancy. Just $7,000 was missing from a secondary maintenance account. Most wives might have assumed it was a simple banking error. Most business owners might have written it off as a misplaced invoice. But I spent 40 years managing corporate audits. I know exactly what a testing phase looks like. Chloe sank lower in her leather chair. All the color drained rapidly from her face, leaving her looking sickly and hollow. She stared at me, realizing the depth of her own foolishness. I started tracking the digital footprints, I continued. I monitored the financial pathways. I watched Greg siphon small amounts of capital from our minor corporate accounts to cover his failing brokerage margins. I documented every single unauthorized transfer. I brought the evidence to Thomas immediately. My voice softened just a fraction as I spoke my late husband's name, but the underlying steel remained intact. My husband was a strong, incredibly kind man. He built this logistics empire from a single delivery truck, but discovering that his own daughter and her husband were actively stealing from him broke his heart. It devastated him. He realized that the moment his health failed, you two would descend like vultures. Greg stopped breathing. The gold pen slipped from his shaking fingers and rolled across the polished mahogany table, coming to a rest against a crystal water glass. "We knew Thomas was sick," I told the silent boardroom. We knew his heart was failing. We also knew that when he passed away, Greg and Chloe would aggressively accelerate their theft. We anticipated they would attempt a hostile takeover to save Greg from his catastrophic gambling debts and his loans with the predatory syndicate. We knew they would try to strip me of my legal rights. So Thomas and I set a trap. Marcus leaned forward. His professional curiosity completely overrode his desire to close the deal. He reached out and broke the red seal on the folder I had placed on the table. He opened the heavy cover and began to read the crisp, complicated legal text inside. I watched his eyes widen as he processed the financial mechanism we had deployed. A power of attorney is an incredibly powerful document, Greg said. I finally turned my gaze to my son-in-law. It grants you total administrative control over a person's individual private assets. It allows you to sell a house held in my name. It allows you to sell corporate shares registered in my name. It gives you the authority to drain my personal checking accounts. But a power of attorney only works if the person actually owns the assets. Greg stared at me. The arrogant bravado had completely drained from his throat. His perfectly tailored suit suddenly looked far too large for his shrinking frame. "What did you do?" Greg whispered. 2 months before Thomas died, we hired a specialized asset protection firm located 3 states away, I explained clearly. We quietly transferred 100% of the corporate shares for this logistics company, along with the deed to our private estate, into an irrevocable blind trust. Chloe let out a sharp, trembling gasp. She understood exactly what those words meant. We completely removed our personal names from all the ownership titles. I continued letting the absolute finality of the statement crush their hopes. The trust is a separate, impenetrable legal entity. It cannot be altered, it cannot be reversed, and it cannot be liquidated by any outside proxy. I am simply the lifetime trustee designated to manage the daily operations. Lucas is the sole named beneficiary. We own nothing on paper. The trust owns everything. I pointed a steady finger at the red folder sitting in front of the Vanguard executive. The corporate shares you are attempting to sell to Vanguard Logistics today do not exist in my name, Greg. They do not exist in Thomas's name. You cannot sell them. Your forged power of attorney is entirely useless against an irrevocable blind trust. You are attempting to sell a $15 million company that you do not own, using a fabricated piece of medical paper that carries absolutely no legal jurisdiction. The junior lawyer sitting next to Marcus was reading the trust documents rapidly over his boss's shoulder. The young man turned completely pale. He looked at Marcus and nodded sharply, confirming every single word I had just spoken. "The trust is ironclad," the junior lawyer said. His voice was laced with genuine professional terror. "The shares belong exclusively to the trust entity. Greg's proxy document is totally void in this context. If we sign this transfer agreement and wire the $15 million to his personal account, we are purchasing fraudulent equity. We would be actively participating in a massive financial crime." Marcus snatched his hand away from the acquisition contracts as if the paper had suddenly caught fire. He stood up so fast his heavy leather chair slammed violently into the glass wall behind him. Vanguard Logistics was a multi-billion-dollar publicly traded conglomerate. The executives sitting at that table were ruthless negotiators, but they were not criminals. The one thing they feared more than losing a lucrative corporate acquisition was being indicted by the federal government for participating in a massive wire fraud conspiracy. A scandal of that magnitude would tank their public stock prices and send their own board of directors to federal prison. "Pack everything up," Marcus ordered his legal team. His voice was harsh, furious, and filled with deep disgust. He glared at Greg as if he were looking at a poisonous snake. "We are leaving right now." The Vanguard executives sprang into action. They scrambled to gather their laptops, their legal pads, and their presentation materials. Briefcases snapped shut with loud, sharp clicks echoing across the quiet boardroom. "Wait," Greg pleaded. He jumped out of his chair, holding his hands up in a desperate gesture of surrender. "Please, Marcus, wait. We can figure this out. We can restructure the deal. I can find a way to break the trust. I just need a few days. You want these distribution yards. You need our freight routes. Please do not walk away." Marcus grabbed his leather briefcase from the table. "You are out of your mind, Greg," the executive said coldly. "You brought us into a room to execute a fraudulent sale using stolen credentials. You tried to make Vanguard Logistics a primary accomplice in the theft of your own mother-in-law's estate. If you ever contact my office again, my first call will be to the federal authorities." Marcus turned his back on my son-in-law. The vanguard team marched out of the boardroom in a tight protective formation. They did not look back. They moved down the hallway and piled into the executive elevator, desperate to put as much distance as possible between themselves and Greg's toxic fraud scheme. The heavy oak doors swung shut behind them, sealing us inside the boardroom. The $15 million sale had just evaporated into thin air. The money that was supposed to save Greg from the predatory lending syndicate was gone forever. Greg stood at the edge of the mahogany table, staring at the empty chairs where his salvation had just been sitting. His chest was heaving. Sweat poured down his forehead, soaking the collar of his expensive dress shirt. He looked like a man who had just stepped off a cliff and was waiting to hit the ground. He slowly turned his head to look at me. The hatred in his pale blue eyes was entirely unmasked. He had lost the company. He had lost the buyout money. And he knew exactly what was waiting for him at the hands of Apex Capital Syndicate. "You ruined everything," Greg snarled. His voice vibrated with a dangerous, unstable energy. "I owed them $1.5 million. The balloon payment is due tomorrow morning. If I do not wire that money to the syndicate by dawn, they are going to take my house. They are going to take my brokerage license. They are going to destroy my entire life." I looked at him with absolute freezing indifference. "You destroyed your own life the moment you decided to steal from the family that fed you," I replied softly. "You destroyed your life the moment you swapped my husband's heart medication for sugar pills." Chloe let out a strangled, sobbing cry from her chair. She buried her face in her hands, unable to look at me, unable to look at the man she had married. "You thought you could leave me in the mud to die," I told my daughter. I kept my voice perfectly level. "You thought you could erase me from the world with a fake medical document. You forgot that I spent 40 years making sure the ledger's always balanced. You tried to steal my life's work, but you walked right into a financial fortress I built specifically to trap you." Greg let out a terrifying guttural scream. He grabbed the heavy crystal water pitcher from the center of the table and hurled it across the room. It smashed against the far wall, sending shards of thick glass and freezing water exploding across the carpet. I did not flinch. Lucas stepped slightly in front of me, planting his feet firmly, ready to defend me if Greg decided to turn his violent rage in our direction. But the final act of this tragedy was not over yet. I had one more piece of evidence to deliver. I had one more trap waiting to spring. Greg thought losing the $15 million was the worst thing that could happen to him today. He had absolutely no idea what was waiting for him outside the glass walls of my corporate building. The reality of his absolute failure finally shattered the last remaining pillars of my son-in-law's sanity. Greg stood at the edge of the long mahogany table, staring at the empty chairs where the vanguard executives had just been sitting. His chest heaved with rapid, shallow breaths. The $15 million he desperately needed to save his life from the predatory lending syndicate was gone. His brokerage firm was dead. His future was entirely erased. He slowly turned his head to look at me. The polished, charismatic investment broker vanished completely. In his place was a cornered, terrified animal. His pale blue eyes were wide and bloodshot, filled with a toxic mixture of sheer panic and unadulterated hatred. "You ruined me," Greg hissed. The words scraped against his throat as if they were tearing his vocal cords. He did not think about the consequences. He did not think about the legal ramifications of assaulting a senior citizen in a corporate building. His survival instinct had completely short-circuited his logic. With a raw, guttural roar, Greg lunged across the open space separating us. He threw his entire body weight forward, his hands curled into violent fists, aiming directly for my neck. He wanted to destroy the woman who had just dismantled his grand illusion. I did not step back. I did not raise my arms to defend myself. I knew I did not have to. Before Greg could cover half the distance between us, Lucas moved. My 21-year-old grandson intercepted the charge with the speed and precision of someone fueled by pure righteous fury. Lucas grabbed Greg by the lapels of his expensive suit jacket, using the older man's own reckless momentum against him. With a sharp, violent twist, Lucas swept Greg off his feet and slammed him face first onto the polished mahogany boardroom table. The impact sounded like a thunderclap. The heavy crystal water glasses rattled against the wood. Greg gasped, all the air rushing out of his lungs in a sharp, pained wheeze. Lucas immediately drove his knee into the small of Greg's back, pinning the broker flat against the hard surface. He twisted Greg's right arm up behind his shoulder blades, locking him in a completely inescapable hold. "Do not even breathe," Lucas ordered. His young voice was deep shaking with an intense, barely contained rage. "Give me one reason to break your arm, Greg. Please, give me one reason." Greg grunted in pain. His cheek pressed awkwardly against the cold wood of the table. He struggled weakly, his polished leather shoes slipping uselessly against the expensive corporate carpet. But he was entirely trapped. Chloe leaped out of her leather chair. She backed away from the table, her hands flying to her mouth in horror. She looked at her husband pinned to the desk, and then she looked at me. Her face was contorted into a mask of pure, hysterical grief. "You are a monster," Chloe screamed at me. Her voice cracked, echoing sharply off the glass walls of the boardroom. "You are a cold, heartless monster. We are your family. We are your own flesh and blood, and you just destroyed our entire lives. You left us with nothing." I turned my gaze to my daughter. I looked at the tears streaming down her face, ruining her perfect makeup. I felt absolutely no pity. The maternal instinct to comfort my child had died the moment she shoved me out of her luxury vehicle and left me to freeze in the mud on a desolate village road. "I am not a monster, Chloe," I replied softly. My voice was perfectly steady, cutting through her hysteria like a razor blade. "I am simply a mirror. I am reflecting your own terrible choices back at you. You chose to treat my life like a balance sheet. I am just closing out the ledger." I walked slowly over to the table where Greg was pinned. I stood directly over him, looking down at his sweating, panicked face. "You really thought the irrevocable blind trust was my only defense mechanism," I told him. "You thought stopping the sale was the end of my strategy. But you forgot what I did for 40 years, Greg. I built compliance systems designed to survive fraud from inside a company, not just attacks from outside it." Greg squeezed his eyes shut as Lucas kept him pinned against the table. 3 months ago, when I first saw money disappearing from our secondary accounts, I added a reporting trigger to the company's tax control system. I continued. Any attempted transfer of the company's assets under a proxy document had to match the biometric authorization in Article 7. If it did not, the transfer agent's compliance system would preserve the filing freeze, the transaction record, and automatically send the supporting package to our outside tax compliance channel for referral to the Internal Revenue Service and the State Fraud Unit. Chloe stopped crying. She lowered her hands and stared at me. "When you filed the preliminary transfer documents this morning with my forged signature, you activated that trigger yourself," I said. "The system captured the power of attorney, the tax identification information you used, the timestamp, and the destination account connected to the proposed sale. Nothing could be deleted after the mismatch was recorded." Greg's eyes opened, the blood drained from his face. "And because the same tax identification was tied to your brokerage business, the compliance review cross-referenced the records Lucas and I had already preserved," I continued. "The inflated revenue statements, the fake client invoices, and the false figures you used in the Apex loan package were included in the fraud referral. The authorities did not receive a rumor. They received a documented trail showing exactly how you tried to turn stolen corporate assets into cash. You notified them," Greg whispered against the wood. "I did not need to make a dramatic phone call," I replied. "You created the report when you tried to force the transfer with a forged proxy. The compliance package was transmitted more than an hour ago. You did not just lose the Vanguard money today, Greg. You placed your own fraud directly in front of federal investigators." Chloe stumbled backward until her shoulders touched the glass wall. She shook her head as if refusing to understand could still change the result. Chloe stumbled backward until her shoulders hit the glass wall of the boardroom. She shook her head violently back and forth, refusing to accept the nightmare unfolding around her. "No!" Chloe sobbed, clutching her designer purse against her chest. "No, we can fix this. We can hire a defense attorney. We can say it was a misunderstanding about the estate planning. We can post bail. We still have the house. We still have some money left in our private accounts. We can fight this in court." I looked at my daughter with a profound, terrifying emptiness. "You have no money left, Chloe," I said quietly. "Your private accounts were frozen by the federal government 30 minutes ago. Your house is currently surrounded by federal agents seizing your assets to cover the fraudulent loan applications. You are completely bankrupt." Before Chloe could utter another word, a new sound pierced the heavy atmosphere of the boardroom. It started as a faint, distant wail echoing from the city streets far below us. Within seconds, the sound multiplied and amplified, growing into a deafening chorus of screaming sirens. The noise reverberated through the thick glass windows of the executive floor. Chloe spun around and pressed her hands against the window pane, looking down at the street level. Dozens of police cruisers and black, unmarked utility vehicles were swarming the plaza in front of our corporate headquarters. Red and blue emergency lights flashed violently, casting chaotic, rotating colors across the brick pavement. Uniformed officers and men wearing tactical jackets poured out of the vehicles, rushing toward the main glass doors of the lobby. "They are here!" Chloe gasped, her voice barely audible over the wailing sirens. "They are coming into the building." Greg began to hyperventilate. His chest heaved rapidly against the mahogany table. He thrashed weakly against Lucas's iron grip, but there was nowhere left to run. The executive elevator banks down the hallway pinged, signaling the arrival of the authorities on the top floor. "I will fight the fraud charges," Greg stammered, his eyes darting frantically around the room. "I will tell them you authorized the loan. I will say you gave me verbal permission to manage the estate. It will be my word against yours. They cannot prove I acted with malicious intent. I will tie this up in litigation for years." I looked down at the man who had torn my family apart. I looked at the broker who thought he could outsmart an auditor. I felt a deep, chilling sense of finality settle over my heart. "They are not just coming up here for the corporate wire fraud, Greg," I said softly. "The financial crimes are simply the justification for the raid. The real reason the authorities are swarming this building is much darker." Greg stopped struggling. A new, far more profound terror washed over his features. "What are you talking about?" I looked at my grandson. "Lucas," I said, "play the audio file." Lucas did not release his physical hold on Greg's back. Instead, he used his free hand to reach into his dark jacket pocket. He pulled out his smartphone and tapped the screen once. He cranked the volume to the absolute maximum and set the device down on the mahogany table right next to Greg's face. A sharp burst of static crackled from the phone speaker. Then a voice echoed through the silent boardroom. It was clear, crisp, and unmistakable. It was Greg's own voice, recorded just hours ago while he was drinking my husband's expensive scotch in our private study. The recorded voice filled the room, delivering a confession that froze the blood in my veins all over again. "Well, hearts are funny things," the recorded version of Greg said casually, "especially when they stop getting the medication they need to keep beating. Those little blue pills he took every morning to regulate his blood pressure. I swapped them out 3 weeks ago. I bought a bottle of dietary supplements online. Just chalk and sugar pressed into little blue tablets. They looked exactly the same. I swapped the bottles while your mother was in the kitchen making tea. It took 3 weeks for his system to fail. Natural causes. No autopsy required." The audio file clicked off, leaving the boardroom in a suffocating, horrifying silence. Greg stared at the phone. His mouth opened and closed, but no sound came out. The arrogant, slick investment broker was entirely gone. He was nothing but an empty shell, realizing he had just listened to his own murder confession. "You were hiding in the closet," Greg whispered, his voice trembling with sheer disbelief. "You heard everything." "I did," I replied, "and so did the homicide detectives at the local precinct when Lucas forwarded that encrypted audio file to their tip line 20 minutes ago. They already dispatched a forensics team to our estate to secure the remaining altered medication bottles from the master bathroom. You left the physical evidence sitting right on the counter." The heavy oak doors of the boardroom burst open. A dozen law enforcement officers flooded into the room. Local police detectives in sharp suits flanked a team of federal agents wearing tactical vests emblazoned with the letters FBI. They moved with absolute coordinated precision. Lucas immediately raised his hands and stepped back from the table, allowing the officers to take control of the hostile suspect. 2 federal agents grabbed Greg by the shoulders and hauled him roughly to his feet. They slammed him face first against the glass wall of the boardroom. The sharp, metallic click of heavy steel handcuffs, ratcheting tightly around his wrists, echoed through the room. Gregory Vance, a senior detective, announced, his voice booming over the chaos. "You are under arrest for federal wire fraud, aggravated identity theft, and first-degree forgery. You are also being detained on overwhelming suspicion of the premeditated murder of Thomas Vance. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law." Greg did not fight them. He did not scream his innocence. His legs gave out beneath him, completely useless, forcing the federal agents to hold his entire body weight as they read him his rights. Across the room, 2 female officers approached my daughter. Chloe was backed into the corner, weeping hysterically, clutching her expensive dress as if it could somehow protect her from the reality of her choices. Chloe Vance, an officer, said, pulling a pair of handcuffs from her utility belt. "You are under arrest for conspiracy to commit wire fraud and acting as a primary accessory after the fact to premeditated murder. Turn around and place your hands behind your back." Chloe looked at the handcuffs, and then she looked across the room at me. Her pale blue eyes, the eyes that looked exactly like her father's, begged me for salvation. She wanted me to step forward. She wanted the mother she had abandoned in the mud to shield her from the consequences of her own greed. "Mom," Chloe sobbed, her voice breaking into a wretched, desperate plea. "Please, tell them I did not know about the medication. Tell them I had nothing to do with the murder. Please, Mom, you cannot let them take me." I stood perfectly still. I watched the officer secure the heavy steel cuffs around my daughter's wrists. I felt absolutely no desire to intervene. "I am sorry, Chloe," I said quietly, watching the officers begin to march her toward the door. "But I am just a confused, fragile old woman with severe dementia. Nobody would believe a single word I say." I turned my back on her. I looked out the massive glass windows at the vast logistics empire my husband and I had built together. The rain had stopped. The heavy clouds were finally beginning to break, letting thin rays of afternoon sunlight spill across the wet pavement of the distribution yard. I listened to the sound of the officers dragging my son-in-law and my daughter out of the boardroom. I listened to the elevator doors slide shut, taking the monsters out of my life forever. I had balanced the ledger. The corporate audit was officially complete. 6 months after the arrests, the morning air was unseasonably warm for late April. I knelt on a thick foam pad in the side garden of my estate, wearing a pair of heavy canvas work gloves. The sun was shining brightly against the red brick of the house, casting long, peaceful shadows across the manicured lawn. I held a pair of sharp steel pruning shears in my right hand. I carefully clipped away the dead gray branches from the massive hydrangea bushes Thomas had planted 3 decades ago. You have to cut away the dead wood if you want the healthy roots to survive. It is a fundamental rule of botany. It is also a fundamental rule of business, and as I had recently learned, it was the most important rule of family. I tossed a brittle, lifeless branch into the green canvas yard waste bag sitting beside my knees. The estate was completely silent. It was a beautiful, restorative silence. There were no corrupt locksmiths changing my door handles. There were no hostile predators wandering through my husband's study. The biometric security gates at the end of the long driveway had been completely upgraded. Lucas had designed the new firewall himself. Nobody could step foot onto this property without my absolute, explicit permission. I wiped a bead of sweat from my forehead with the back of my wrist. I looked up at the clear blue sky and thought about the storm that had raged on the day of my husband's funeral. I thought about the sheer suffocating terror of standing on that desolate village road covered in freezing mud, watching the red taillights of my own daughter's luxury vehicle disappear into the dark pine forest. That terrified, abandoned widow felt like a distant memory now. She had been replaced by a woman forged in the fires of a hostile corporate takeover. The federal justice system moves incredibly slowly for minor infractions, but it moves with terrifying, unrelenting speed when presented with a neatly packaged multi-million-dollar wire fraud and a recorded murder confession. Greg did not walk away. He did not tie the government up in years of expensive litigation. When the Federal Bureau of Investigation raided our corporate boardroom and seized his digital devices, they found everything they needed to bury him alive. The federal prosecutors did not even have to work hard to build their case against him. I had provided them with a flawless, completely verified audit of his entire criminal existence. I attended his sentencing hearing 4 months after the raid. I sat in the front row of the federal courthouse wearing a sharp navy blue business suit. I watched the heavily armed bailiffs lead my son-in-law into the room. Greg was not wearing his tailored Italian suits anymore. He was wearing a shapeless, bright orange prison jumpsuit. His wrists and ankles were chained together. The arrogant, slick investment broker who thought he could outsmart an auditor was entirely gone. His hair was thinning. His posture was broken. He looked like a hollow, hollowed-out shell of a human being. The federal judge did not show him a single ounce of mercy. Greg was convicted of aggravated identity theft, massive federal wire fraud, and the premeditated murder of my husband. The audio recording of his arrogant confession in my private study had echoed through the courtroom during the trial, sealing his fate forever. He was sentenced to 25 years in a maximum security federal penitentiary. He will be an old, broken man by the time he ever sees the outside of a concrete cell again. And the predatory lending syndicate he owed money to. Apex Capital was raided by the federal authorities 3 days after Greg was arrested. The evidence I handed over to the government provided the exact probable cause they needed to freeze the syndicate's operational assets. The loan sharks who tried to leverage my logistics company are currently facing their own federal racketeering charges. But the hardest fall belonged to my daughter. Chloe tried to negotiate her way out of the nightmare. The moment the federal agent snapped the handcuffs around her wrists in my corporate boardroom, she turned on her husband. She offered to testify against Greg in exchange for full legal immunity. She wept in the interrogation room. She claimed she was just a frightened, abused wife who had absolutely no idea that Greg was swapping her father's heart medication for sugar pills. She played the victim card with the same desperate theatrical precision she had used at the cemetery. But the federal prosecutors had access to her digital footprint. They recovered text messages proving she had actively participated in bribing the corrupt judge. They found emails showing she had coordinated the fabricated dementia narrative with the fraudulent doctor. She was not a victim. She was a willing, calculated co-conspirator. Facing decades behind bars, Chloe finally broke. She accepted a harsh plea deal from the prosecuting attorney. She pled guilty to conspiracy to commit wire fraud and acting as a primary accessory to elder abuse. She was sentenced to 5 years in a federal women's correctional facility. The prison sentence was only the beginning of her punishment. The government seized absolutely everything she owned to pay restitution and federal fines. Her luxury Range Rover was auctioned off by the state. Her massive, heavily mortgaged house was foreclosed on and liquidated. Her designer clothes, her expensive jewelry, and her pristine bank accounts were completely wiped out. She was stripped of her freedom, her wealth, and her identity. 2 months ago, I received a handwritten letter in my mailbox. It had a federal prison return address stamped on the corner. It was from Chloe. I did not open it. I did not read the desperate apologies or the begging pleas I knew were written inside. I simply carried the envelope to the kitchen sink, struck a match, and watched the paper burn until it was nothing but gray ash. Then I washed it down the drain. You cannot allow toxic liabilities back onto a clean ledger. A loud rumbling sound broke my concentration. I stood up from the garden mat and brushed the dirt from the knees of my denim work pants. I looked down the long paved driveway. The heavy iron security gates were sliding open smoothly. A brand-new heavy-duty commercial pickup truck drove onto the estate. The glossy black paint gleamed in the afternoon sunlight. Emblazoned on the side door was the bright, bold logo of our freight logistics company. The truck pulled up to the front portico, and the heavy diesel engine rumbled to a stop. The driver door opened and Lucas stepped out. I smiled at the sight of my grandson. He was no longer the exhausted, stressed college student in a faded hoodie hiding out in a cheap roadside motel. Lucas was wearing a crisp white dress shirt with the sleeves rolled up to his elbows. He wore a dark tie and tailored trousers. He carried a thick leather portfolio under his right arm. He walked with a new, undeniable confidence. He was 21 years old, but he carried the authority of a seasoned executive. The irrevocable blind trust had named him as the sole beneficiary of the estate and the corporate empire. But I was not simply handing him a massive fortune to waste. I was teaching him how to run it. Lucas was now officially the vice president of operations for our logistics firm. He split his time between finishing his cybersecurity degree and learning the daily realities of the commercial freight industry. Afternoon, Grandma Lucas called out, walking across the manicured grass to meet me by the hydrangeas. He looked at the pile of dead branches in my yard waste bag. "You are working hard today." "Just clearing away the rot," I replied, pulling off my canvas gloves. "It keeps the foundation strong." "How are things at the corporate office today?" Lucas grinned. His dark eyes were bright with genuine excitement. "Things are perfectly balanced," he said, using my favorite accounting phrase. Vanguard Logistics officially backed away from all their hostile acquisition attempts. They realized our corporate structure is completely impenetrable, and that new national supply chain contract we bid on last month, the regional director just signed the paperwork. We are adding 12 new delivery routes to the Western Division. "That is excellent work, Lucas," I told him, feeling a deep, profound swell of pride in my chest. "Your grandfather would be incredibly proud of the man you are becoming. He built that trucking fleet from nothing. Knowing that you are protecting it means everything." Lucas looked at the large brick house, and then he looked back at me. His expression softened, replacing the corporate executive with the loving grandson. "I am just glad you are safe, Grandma," he said quietly. "I am glad we fought back. We did not just fight back, Lucas. We secured the future," I reminded him. I reached out and patted his shoulder. "Go inside and put those operational files on my desk in the study. We will go over the quarterly fuel projections after I finish pruning these bushes." Lucas nodded. He turned and walked into the grand foyer of the house, leaving the heavy oak front door propped open behind him to let the warm spring breeze circulate through the hallways. I stood alone in the garden for a long moment. I looked down at the dark, rich soil clinging to my bare hands. I rubbed my thumb across my fingertips, feeling the grit of the earth. I turned my body slightly facing the open expanse of the lawn. I looked directly ahead, speaking to the invisible audience that had followed this entire harrowing journey. I spoke to the people who had watched my family tear itself apart for the sake of greed. I spent my entire life balancing complex corporate ledgers. I said, my voice steady, calm, and resolute. I spent 40 years making absolutely certain that every single column added up. I tracked missing assets. I identified massive liabilities. I ensured that the math of every business was rooted in undeniable truth. I paused, letting the gentle breeze rustle the green leaves of the hydrangeas beside me. When my own daughter tried to erase me from the world, I simply applied the exact same rules I used in the boardroom, I explained. She created a massive deficit in our family. She attempted to steal my life's work to cover her husband's toxic debts. She viewed me not as a mother, but as an obstacle to be discarded in the freezing mud. So I balanced the accounts. I took away her freedom. I took away her stolen wealth. I took away her future. I left her with nothing but the exact empty darkness she tried to leave me in. I looked down at my hands one more time and then looked back up, my gaze piercing and unyielding. "Some people tell me I should have shown her mercy," I said quietly. "They tell me that because she is my own flesh and blood, I should have stopped the federal agents. I should have hired her a defense attorney. I should have forgiven her betrayal because family is supposed to be unconditional." I shook my head slowly. "But I believe family is built on respect," I stated. "Family is built on loyalty, on shared burdens, and on mutual protection. It is not built on blood alone. Blood simply makes you related. Behavior makes you family. Lucas acted like family. Chloe acted like a hostile predator. I treated her accordingly. I took a slow, deep breath, letting the warm air fill my lungs. I felt a profound sense of absolute peace settle over my soul. "Tell me," I asked, leaning slightly forward, addressing the listener with a question that demanded an honest answer. "If your own child drove you out to a deserted dirt road in a freezing storm and left you for dead, would you have let them rot in a concrete cell, or would you have forgiven them?"